Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming today. This talk, I was inspired kind of by, I think what Linnea, she was saying, hey, I really wanted to do something with Chinese medicine, and I really wanted to, maybe, what you're good at is taking the Chinese medicine concepts and really, blending them with the biomedicine stuff. And I was like, okay, sure. Let me see what I can put together. And so I came up with these sort of three parts, to this management of chronic disease with Chinese medicine and biomedical analysis. And the concept here is to really kind of lay it out for all of you. And I don't know if you've looked at the slides already, but just to kind of lay out these two ways of viewing the world, like two different lenses, layer them together so you can kind of telescope back and forth between them. And I want you to be able to do this yourself. And you have to be a doctor of Chinese medicine to know how to use the macro ecological sort of perspective. When you're looking at someone, you're seeing gross changes, the colors, you're smelling things, you're looking at their form, all the things that we might do from the perspective of this sort of ecological perspective or ecological medicine. Taking that and then, getting into the biological analysis, right? We're looking at someone's blood, we're looking in the microscope, we're finding out what's there, and just take those two different sort of perspectives and be able to move freely back and forth between them. That's what this is about. I hope that's interesting. I wanted it to be. Okay, so the first part of this is going to be breaking down kind of like what the 5 organ networks and kind of the Chinese medicine and sort of general ecological perspective, and kind of talk about that a little bit and what it is. And then we'll get into the first part, which is the spleen qi deficiency syndrome, and then metabolic syndrome and phlegm dampness, and then eventually blood stagnation, and then coagulation and cancer and all of that. So it's going to be a nice, long, gentle journey. And so you guys just stay with me and feel free to ask questions along the way. I'm happy to answer whatever might come up. Okay, so I started with fractals because when we're looking at patterns in nature, you can see that there's this beautiful repeating pattern that keeps on going, or I should say repeating of patterns, where you have, something like this snowflake you see in this picture, right? Where it's a geometric pattern that occurs again and again, different sizes and at different scales, right, within the same object. So the snowflake's edge, where you look at the snowflake, then you look at one of its arms, you look down at its arms to one of the arms off that arm, and then one of the arms off that arm. You'll keep seeing the same pattern repeated over and over again. Same thing when you look at a river, right? You look at it from a long ways away, you see how it's moving and branching, and then you get closer and closer and closer, and you'll see that the branches kind of follow the same bifurcating patterns. The splitting of veins in a fern. Look at a plant and see the way that it grows and how it moves. Again, it keeps repeating these patterns. And then like lightning, right? Where again, it's a branch, the first branch, second branch, third. And as you get smaller and smaller, you'll see that the branches keep sort of repeating the same pattern. This is just one of those kind of fundamental truths of nature, kind of a fundamental principle of nature. And that's what this is about unfolding these principles, what kind of principles we can see in nature, and then how do we bring those to the modern medical mind. So fractal synchrony, right? This is when we have a process that is chaotic, nonlinear, and dynamic, right? So all biological processes are this way. You have the chaotic processes occurring in synchrony. So again, it's not like this isn't a linear, algorithmic type of thing we're talking about. This is life. It's complex. It's chaos. But it's also happening in these repeating patterns in this, what you would say, somehow organized or maybe orchestrated way, that this chaotic activity is happening in a way that produces some kind of emergent structure or emergent behavior that is life, that is this place that we live in. This is what we're talking about. So I talked about this, like how the repeating patterns happen from small to large, right? They go across these different, what I call holonics. This is a word that's used to describe a different layer or a size of perspective, where you would look at something at a very small holonic, and then you would go bigger and bigger. If you went from, like, let's say we're here in the university, then we went up to this town of Asheville, then we went up to the state of North Carolina, went up to the United States, then we went to North America, then we went to eventually to the world, and then we went up to the solar system, and then from there we went to our galaxy, and then you go up to the universe and to the multiverse or whatever. So these are holonics, right? And that at these different holonics, you can see that these patterns and principles are maintained throughout the whole thing. There's things that repeat themselves throughout all the holonics. So when you apply your perception, your observation, as the Taoist monks did, the Taoist doctors, those people who were first sort of observing nature and trying to understand what's going on in nature that links us to it, and how do we find our health and our way within it. Because we can observe in nature all these things that are happening. There's hot and cold. There's dry. There's wet. There's up and down. There's big and small. There's forceful and there's meek. And there's all these different things that, dualities we can see. So they kept seeing those things over and over again. And that was happening at the gross level of the human being, having this connection with nature. But now we want to be able to apply that into this reduction of life into its parts, right? And this is where we have this idea from, modern medicine and modern science, where you're taking what we're looking at here and we're reducing it through a microscope down into something very small, right? And at that small level, we often look for things that we call mechanisms, little particles. What is it? It's a molecule. It's a cell. It's a structure. It's an atom. And then we have these isolated interactions where we want to look at how does this molecule interact with that one? How does this cell interact with this thing? And that's what kind of we've gotten into. And this is this reductionist approach. And so what I'm trying to describe is that if we look at the world from the perspective of a human being living in nature, can we take the principles that we see there, things like hot and cold, things like excess and deficiency, can we apply that to the microscope when we're looking at the way that these molecules interact or the way that these cells interact? And we can. And we want to. And we want to maintain the complexity. We want to really continue to hold the thought that these are chaotic processes that are fractals that repeat themselves, okay? So let's jump into the internal biological train. Again, I keep using this word ecology, ecological network perspective. Everything's woven together. Functional relationships. Functional, not just based on form, on what we can see under the microscope, but actually based on the function of these networks in the body. And then we're going to talk about the soil, right? The soil that is us, that makes us up, what the microbes in our body live in and what our cells live in, the functional relationships between things. And then this idea of permaculture. Permaculture is permanent agriculture. So the idea is, how can I design things that grow and live in the same space that all share together resources and make it more self-reliant, make it so that it's more self-sufficient, even close to sustainable, if you could, if you think of that word. That's kind of a hard word in this world, but that things are all in a place and in a way that they support each other so that it doesn't take much extra input to keep it going. That's the idea with our body. How do we get to that kind of permaculture in the human body place? And that's what I will always, when I was originally studying medicine, I was a pre-med major at the University of Minnesota. But I got really kind of disillusioned by the whole idea of a single molecule and a single target in a pharmaceutical industry-driven practice. And I was like, God, this just doesn't sound like where I want to be. So I actually abandoned medicine and I went to permaculture. I actually went to studied alternative energy systems and got really into Bill Mollison's work and the idea that we could actually create healing at a much bigger level, like actually change something for the way that we live to make it healthier so that we weren't as sick and not just trying to help treat sick people. And then, of course, I got pulled back into medicine through a kind of long, convoluted story, but came back into Chinese medicine, which kind of came back around to, okay, well, how can I do permaculture in the human body with people? And that's kind of where I got to. So that's what this is all about. So network physiology is another concept, and you'll see that most of these slides will have a reference at the bottom that, tells you where I got this information or these ideas so that they're not just coming from me just thinking out in space and having cool ideas. That's fun too. But most of this stuff is coming from the research bench, which is where people who are really creative and really interested and smart are putting together ideas and researching how these ideas play out in the world and then publishing papers on them. And then you can dig and find these things, right? And a lot of times that research is way ahead of what's happening in clinical practice. We'll see that a lot. Maybe in oncology, 20 years is where that sort of like that breach is between where we can conceptualize where we want to be with the research and then where we actually are with the practice. It's very hard to get from the research bench to the clinical practice. It takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of effort, over a long period of time. So anyway, so here's the idea, right? So medical specialists focusing on a single physiological system. Cardiologists examine the heart. They look at ECG signals, right? Pulmonologists looking at lung structure and function. probing the respiratory patterns. You have brain neurologists that utilize MRIs and brainwave EEG signals, right? And the human organism is actually an integrated network where these multi-component organ systems are interacting through various mechanisms across different spatiotemporal scales to optimize and coordinate their function. So the concept is, again, the specialist has this limitation because they're looking at one part of this integrated whole. And that's where we move into this idea of bioregulatory systems medicine. And if there's one kind of word that sums up sort of this, what I do, which is this kind of combination of traditional Chinese medicine and traditional medicine in general, and then, kind of weaving it with biomedical concepts, this bioregulatory systems medicine, and you'll find there's a lot of papers out there on this topic and people are really into it. But it's basically like taking this whole idea of complexity, making that the fundamental principle of health and medicine and physiology, and starting there and saying, well, we don't know what everything is. We don't know how things interact. We can't describe a certain system or a certain interaction or a certain disease based on the interaction of two parts. We need to actually take those two parts, consider them within this very complex whole. And so we start to get into this different way of analyzing the human body. And so you can see here on the right is system science, on the left, reductionism, and on the right, you see that you have medicine should reflect system-wide benefits with an understanding that everything in the body is connected and in flux, right? It's always changing, which is where in pharmaceutical medicine, often what we're trying to do is we're trying to stop something from happening, right? We're trying to block a pathway, block a receptor, or we're trying to make something happen, push something, activate a receptor, provide a hormone, provide a stimulus that directs function. But it's a very single pointed kind of approach, and it's telling the body what to do. Whereas the way that we work as people that love botanical medicine, as herbalists, we like to help the body do what it already knows how to do, right? We want to see what the patterns of dysfunction are, and then we want to apply our medicines and let them help do the work of bringing the body back into balance. That's the difference between the two sides. And you can see on the right, you have multidimensional use, you have time-sensitive synergism between things, individualized treatments, not disease-driven treatments. It's not, you don't give the person a disease diagnosis based on a lab value and then give them the treatment that's for that. That's a very simplistic way of doing medicine. So we like to look at the whole person and make an individualized assessment and treatment. So layering diagnostic lens is what I'm talking about, right? Taking that macroscopic perspective, holding the principles, we're going to look at this, and then going into the microscope and then pulling those two together. So here's just what I mean when I talk about the microenvironment. These are the measurable microscopic factors that contribute to the health of the patient or the strength of the disease. Internal biological terrain markers. That's a term that I'm going to use a lot. It's kind of a term that we use with Madiri Center, with Donnie and myself, and a lot of folks who do this similar work. It's this quantitative evaluation of what's going on in the blood or in the urine or in the microbiota in the stool. And so it includes the microbiota. It includes the immune system, the cells there, the rheology of the blood, sort of the viscosity of it, the coagulation factors, the nutritional status, inflammatory signaling, hormone presence and activity, the balance of electrolytes, organ function, serum proteins, redox antioxidant status, like glutathione status, things like that, organic acids. All of that is part of this microenvironment that we're talking about, okay? And so the internal biological terrain assessment really looks at the microscopic elements in the body, right? In the blood, serum and plasma testing, that's primary. And most of the data that we have out there when you're looking at, you look at something, a test, and you say, okay, well, is this test valid? Is it good? Is this, does this value I'm getting, does this represent like a real number, or is this sort of somebody's experiment? And I'm not really sure. Well, we want to know that. And in order to know that, you kind of have to follow the research, get into the literature. And if you follow the literature closely, you'll find that the plasma and serum testing, which is the primary tool used by most of your medical doctors in this, today, it is very accurate, for many of these values. So that's kind of the primary thing we use also. But additionally, you have things like, molds, testing for molds, right? The mycotox panel, right? You have testing for metals, heavy metal testing. You have provoked and unprovoked metal testing. You have environmental toxins testing, right? Looking for things that might show up in people's blood. They can be associated with any kind of things like plastics or styrofoams or refrigerants or things like that show up, pesticides, etc. Organic acids, again, like the metabolism in the body. What is the person, metabolizing in their intake? What are they breaking down things into? Hormones, neurotransmitters, and chemical toxins too. Stool tests and cultures, urine tests and cultures, what's there, and then nutrient evaluations, like the Nutri-Eval test, which is a good one. SpectraCell is good too. They look at the white blood cells to try to get more of an accurate idea about what's in the tissue. Because remember, when you're testing for something in the blood, you're getting a blood level, but that's the level of the material that's moving around the body. That's not what's in the tissues. That's not what's in your heart or in your muscle or in your organ. It's in the blood. So how do we translate that to what's actually going on in the tissues? Well, we can either kind of take tissue samples of a bunch of things and then compare that to the blood levels and see if they're accurate. That's hard to do, especially with humans, because we're not, taking chunks out of people. It's not really that, kosher of a thing to do. So most of the time we're kind of projecting. We're kind of trying to, just give an idea, but we don't actually know. Like, for example, magnesium, it's a very complex nutrient. It's very useful in so many different, enzymatic reactions in the body. And the serum testing isn't very accurate because the vast majority of the magnesium is in other places. It's in the bone, it's in the tissues, etc. So there are other ways to kind of hopefully determine if there's an actual deficiency or not. So the ecological approach, right? Observation of the natural world. Here we go. I'm just going to jump in a little bit into the Chinese medicine 5-organ network, what I call sort of elemental endocrinology. And this is where you can see here you have 5 elements, right, that make up this world. These are these Taoist monks that were sitting in the forest, by the waterfall, sipping plum wine, imagining health and imagining disease and trying to understand what it was all about. And they looked at nature and they determined that there were 5 primary elements, right? So you had wood, which of course gives rise to fire when it burns. Fire then gives rise to earth because the wood burns, living things growing, burning. The fire create the earth, the foundation for the other things to grow. And then as that condenses and gets compressed, it becomes metal. That's really the mountains. And you can see like the volcano coming up and creating this mountain of metal, the metallic metal. If you look at the top of a mountain, what happens? There's no more trees up there. There's no more wood there. It's all rock and mineral. And at the top, what does it do? Then it magnetically attracts water to it. You look at the top of Mount Shasta where I live, it's always got clouds circling it, right? It's drawing water. And so the water, and this is called the generating cycle here. Wood generates fire, generates earth, generates metal, generates water, generates wood again. And obviously water generates wood. We know that, right? Water is the key to life on earth, right? All living, growing things. But the metal is really cool because it literally is this drawing of mineral magnetic energy to pull water to it, and then these rivers flowing down through these metallic sort of channels to deliver that water all over the ground to make the wood that grows up, that then repeats the cycle of the fire to burn, create the earth, and then all cycle. But then that sort of basic concept then is just tied to all these different parts of everything we observe. It can be applied across all the different holonics. The 12 organs, right? We have 12 of those. You can see there. The wood is liver and gallbladder. The fire, you have the small intestine and the heart. Earth, we have the stomach and the spleen. The fire also has the triple warmer and the pericardium, the surrounding around the heart. The metal is the lung and large intestine. Water is kidney and bladder. So those are the 12 organs that make up this endocrine system or elemental endocrinology. And the 5 primary organs, the most important ones, are the ones that you see as the yin organ, or what I should say, the solid organ that's associated with each of the elements. So for water, you have the kidneys. For wood, you have the liver. For fire, you have the heart. Earth is the spleen. And metal is the lung. Those are the 5 primary organ networks. And then from those, each of those 5 primary organs has a paired organ. And you'll see it there. It's on the outside of the circle. And the thing about this is so cool is that with every organ system, there's a solid organ that's a secretor that secretes hormones, that secretes all kinds of things that the body uses to communicate. And then the paired organ is hollow, and it's an excretor. It releases what the body's not using. So like the lung is the secretor, and then the large intestine is the excretor. The heart is the secretor, and then the small intestine is the excretor. These are, again, hollow organs that are releasing material versus the solid organ that are secreting and making things. And then that basic concept is yin and yang. So the yin organ is the one that's solid, that's the secretor, that's making things. And the yang organ is the hollow one that's releasing. Does that make sense, everybody? You guys follow me? Okay, cool. Try to make this as simple as possible without, too much rambling. So here's the organ networks again. They're based on function, not on form. Okay? Functional organ networks. It's very important. And throughout this talk, you'll see that when I capitalize an organ like spleen or kidney, heart, it means I'm talking about the functional organ network from Chinese medicine. If it's lowercase, I'm talking about the form of the organ that we describe in biomedicine, right? The kidney, right? It's the kind of kidney bean shaped organ that's in the retroperitoneum. Like we talk about that. That's an organ. It's the kidney. It's a lowercase. If I talk about capital K kidney, I'm talking about the Chinese medicine kidney, which is a functional network that they defined as how this part of the body worked before they had dissected the body and pulled out the kidney and said, this is the kidney. Does that make sense? And I'll make that more clear as we go. But here's just another look here. You can see, again, classifying these things, 5 elements: heart, spleen, lung, kidney, liver, heart, spleen, lung, kidney, liver. Again, generating. The generating is the arrows that are solid. And there's something called the co-cycle that goes across. You can see that the liver to spleen, you can see heart to lung, you can see spleen over to kidney. And there's a generating cycle, and then there's like a supportive cycle, and then there's also an inhibitory cycle, a controlling cycle. For example, the liver, the wood, and the earth have this relationship you can see there, and wood controls earth. It's like, well, what does that mean? Well, in people, it means that the liver has a big impact on your digestion. This gets back to emotion, anger, frustration, the things that the liver manifests, and how that makes you start to feel like you can't digest stuff. We'll talk about that because that's a really important piece of this whole thing. But when you look at in nature, well, you look at the side of where the mountain is crumbling down. Well, the wood is there holding the earth. It holds it in place. You'll also see that when water tries to flow through areas, wood can overgrow in that area and make it not flow very well. It can block that flow. Wood can grow up inside of the ponds and networks and make it really thick and muddy. All these kind of things that we're going to talk about in the body have their original concept in nature. Okay? Just another look here. These are the today kind of view of the organ, right? The kidney, fear and fright are the emotions. The liver, anger and frustration. The heart, hate and impatience. These are the toxic emotions, right? The spleen, worry and anxiety. The lung, sadness and depression. And you can just keep going deeper and deeper with this stuff. But these are kind of, again, those are the forms that we see today. When you say the liver, we think of those 3 hepatic lobes, right? You see the heart, you think about the 4 chambers and, et cetera. You think about the kidney and you see the nephrons, right? And you see the ureters. But those structures are not necessary for us to understand the functional organ network with the same name. Okay? It's based on function. I love wolves. The spirit of the organ networks. So each organ network has its own spirit, a part of us that's a spiritual part of us. Okay? In the spleen, in our digestive center, is our mind, the yi, our intellect. And if you remember back in 2016, I did a talk that was called, Healing the Gut-Brain Axis. It was all about the neuroendocrine system and its relationship to the microbiota. I don't know if you caught that, but it's another intensive I did. It was like a 4-hour thing, but it really went in deep on the way that the microbiota interacts with the mind. We're going to get at some of that. And it's all about the old idea. This is thousands of years ago. These guys were like, look, the mind is not housed in the brain. The mind is focused in your gut. This is where you feel it. This is where you think from. The thoughts then are created to become actualized into language through the brain. The brain organizes it into our cultural now of human beings. But the experience of it and the thought of it, the mind, is coming from here. And there's 500 million neurons right here in your mesenteric nervous system. And that's where your thought comes from. And that's what these people were talking about. Thought organization and structure in the brain, thought origination in the gut. So the spirit of the heart is the shen. This is kind of like, it opens into the mouth through the tongue. And it's like when you speak your truth, it emanates from your eyes. And you look at someone's eyes, you can see their shen. If their shen is bright, their prognosis is good. If their shen is dim, prognosis is not so good. You can see it in someone's eyes. You see it. Look at your older animal, right? The animal you've been with that's kind of getting there. He's like, their eyes are to gray over, right? The shen is kind of, fading, right? That's how we see that. But each of these things has a way you can identify sort of what's happening with that part of the spirit. So for the Po, which is the living animal soul, lives in the lungs, which is, of course, tied directly to the breath. It's the most close relationship we have to any element, right? It's this air, like, if I stop breathing for 5 minutes, I'm done. That's it. End of my life, right? It's so direct. And so this mortality, this constant breath, the animal part of us that constantly keeps us breathing, keeps us alive, keeps that oxygen in our tissues, that's housed in the lungs, and its partner organ is the large intestine. The hun, or the undying soul, is in the liver. This is the part of us that dreams, the astral realms. When you're going through your dreams, you have all these visions and things. You're going through your emotions. That's the hun. That's the liver. And then the zhi, your will, is housed in the kidneys, the push to drive on, to fulfill, whatever your destiny is here in life. And so the life force is a concept I love as sort of this. It's a little bit more broad than talking about chi, right? We talk about chi as like this, active force in the body, but the life force as an organizing principle that unites the actions of the body into a cohesive whole. The life force is that which basically is present in everything, that keeps everything alive and going. It's this force that we can work with that unifies an organism. I like the idea that it fights or it resists the dissipative forces of the universe around us, right? It resists entropy. We're not falling apart and just going into nothing, right? We're not just dissolving into molecules. No, we're held together. What is that? What is that does that? That's the life force. And that's what we're going to be working with when we talk about the chi of the body. So here we go. Before we jump into the actual first part of this talk, this is really the introduction. We're going to look at these biomedical concepts and the TCM pathological factors and how they overlay. So I want to just again, like I said, go back and forth, right? Between concepts from traditional medicine and biomedical scientific analyses, right? Or concepts. So on the left, you see there, right? Biomedical concepts. Rheology imbalance, meaning in the blood, the clotting factors are disrupted in some way. Hypercoagulation. This is a major factor in cancer. It's also a major factor in cardiovascular disease. It's also a major factor in a lot of our named diseases because it's tied to other changes like inflammation, like insulin resistance, like having, what we're going to get into, this phlegm damp syndrome in part 2 of this, and then looking at metabolic syndrome and looking at how people today, with more inactivity and taking in more fuel, we start to have problems that result in many endocrine changes, but one of them being this hypercoagulation issue that starts to come up and leads to a lot of mortality and morbidity. Strokes, sometimes a fate worse than death, unfortunately, for some people, to have a stroke and lose so much of your function that you literally are just sort of here. Someone's just kind of supporting you alive, but you're not really able to do anything or be present. It's a really scary thought. And even just going deep into Alzheimer's with people really just not being able to remember anything that's happening. These are scary things. And it's oftentimes these diseases are a buildup of stuff in our bodies, whether it's beta amyloid or tau proteins or fibrous tangles or, atherosclerosis and calcification in the vasculature. It's always stuff that's building up. And that's part of what this is about, because these pathological factors that Chinese medicine talks about, like dampness and phlegm and heat and cold, they're all buildup of stuff. It's just that it's not as specific. So look at all these different things. Angiogenesis, right? That's tied with hypercoagulation and hypoxia, like the loss of oxygen in tissues. We're going to talk about that. Inflammation. This is like the big topic, right? Oh, I think what's wrong? Oh, I've got inflammation. Yeah, I think I've got inflammation. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I bet you do. We all do. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. But you might have some inflammatory dysregulation. That happens. But all these things are tied together, right? So the imbalance in the microbiota, and I always think about, infections, right? Especially like infections in the gut or infections in the bladder. It's the bugs didn't just jump onto your body and then go find a way in there and then set up a colony. No, they're there. They're just out of balance. Why? Because the soil is different. The soil supports bugs that aren't happy and healthy for you. Well, they might be happy, but they're not making you happy. Right? So the soil, oxidative damage, not being able to control this constant oxygen-rich life that we have where we're always generating free radicals. We have to quench them always. Insulin and glucose dysregulation. We'll talk a lot about that with metabolic syndrome. Lipid imbalances, cholesterol issues. And I want to talk about that because there's a lot of misunderstanding in that realm. Basically we're all suffering from a statin deficiency, right? We've figured that out, right? We should just they should be in our drinking water. I mean, that's real. Lymphatics, right? The lymphatic system, all that stuff that goes on there. Chronic metabolic acidosis. That's a really cool one. Just that over time, under stress of many different kinds, we tend to become acidic. We tend to have not that we're going to change the pH of our blood. If we do, we're in big trouble. Blood is like 7.4. That's all the time. It can get to like 7.2 or something, but beyond that, you're hospital. You're just, your body can't do that. But we have to buffer that acidity all the time. And the buffering requires materials. And if we use those materials, we become deficient in them. And now our buffering systems are weak and the rest of our tissues suffer. And so that's how chronic metabolic acidosis plays out in our health and our sickness. And then growth factors, all kinds of growth factors. We're going to talk about insulin-like growth factor as one of the big ones, right? Which is one that you think of, you see IGF, right? IGF-1 and how important it is in lots of different diseases like cancer. It's related to a number of different endocrine system factors. So if we take all those concepts and we go over to the right and we see here, well, qi stagnation. This is back to emotions a lot of times, where the energy in the body can't move very well. But I think of qi being part of the nerve flow. All the blood vessels have nerves around them. That nerve needs impulse. The lymph system also, it has to have a kinetic action, a qi type of action. And qi stagnation is where there's literally a decrease in the flow through an area, through the tissues of the body. And you find it when you overlay systems like, say, fascial planes with acupuncture meridians. They overlay really beautifully, really nicely. And when you see stagnation in acupuncture meridians, it's happening in these fascial planes. Well, guess what else moves through fascial planes? Blood vessels, lymph ducts, nerves. When you overlay them, you're like, oh, wow, those acupuncture meridians, those fairy dust, stardust ideas, they actually are a map of the body when you looked at it from the outside, determining what was happening on the inside without dissecting it. Now that we dissected it, we see that the map's pretty darn accurate as far as where the energy is moving. But the energy is just not moving, through the muscles and random areas. No, it's following the routes of the nerves, the blood vessels, the lymph ducts. And when qi stagnation gets to be more intense, we get blood stagnation. And blood stagnation is always associated with, pain. The simplest way to look at it is like a bruise where the body got damaged and then the blood came out of the blood vessels and then it sat there and it lost its oxygen. It changed color. You can see the bruise in the body, stagnant blood. But it happens at other subtle levels. It's a big part of cancer. It's a big part of cardiovascular disease. And when you get into like hypercoagulation, blood stagnation, we're going to see that tie and how that correlates really well. Heat and heat toxins, again, inflammation, imbalances in the microbiota, oxidative damage, phlegm, dampness, turbidity, that's insulin and glucose dysregulation, lipid imbalance, lymph problems, spleen dampness. This is also part of this insulin glucose dysregulation. You'll see that in invisible phlegm. That's very close to that lipid imbalance stuff that's going on. Fatty acid metabolism, liver stagnation, the lymph system, inability to deal with oxidative damage. The Sanjiao, the triple warmer, that's our fluid metabolism system in Chinese medicine. Organ-specific factors like, the kidney yin, the kidney yang, the liver blood, the liver qi, the spleen qi. These are all kind of correlated with growth factors, things that come out of the bone marrow that direct function in the body. This is how we overlay and correlate these seemingly disparate ideas, but they're not. They're very, very useful to use them both together. And I want to just reinforce, these are corollaries. They're not direct, right? We're not saying that one thing equals the other. We're saying that when we put a few of these concepts together, we can see how well, when you overlay them, we can deepen our perspective and enhance our ability to work with the materials that we have. Deficiencies in the complete blood count, red blood cells, erythrocytes, right? Anemia, white blood cell deficiencies, neutrophils and lymphocytes, thrombocytopenia, platelets, right? Then on the right, you have TCM stuff like blood deficiency, which can be anemia, but it can be a bigger thing than that. Blood is a bigger concept in Chinese medicine. It houses the nutrients, it houses the blood, the white blood cells and things like that. Qi deficiency of that active force, and this is where you get to the idea of Zheng Qi. Zheng Qi is like any resistive force in the body, like the immune system. And the Wei Qi is like also like immune function. We would correlate it very much with the white blood cell counts. And you'll see that as we go through this, when you want to tonify the blood, what you're also doing is supporting the erythrocytes and anemia. So if you have a patient, a cancer patient who's real deficient, who's anemic, you use herbs to tonify the blood to help build those red blood cells. If the person has white blood cell deficiency, their white blood cells are getting hammered by chemotherapy, say you want to build that up, then you go ahead and you use qi tonics. You want to build their qi in that case. And a person who has thrombocytopenia, if their platelets are really suffering, you use essence tonics for the platelets. And this is stuff that's, again, really good correlations to have so that when you see more specific stuff happening in a person's blood work, and then you look at what's happening to them symptom-wise, you overlay the two, they work well, then you tonify the area that needs the most support. And then here's just one more look at parallels. Nutrients, protein, electrolytes, renal function, hormone deficiencies, adrenal fatigue, and those things tying right here with organ network-specific deficiencies, like I mentioned before. They can be deficiency of yin, yang, qi, blood, essence, marrow, Chinese medicine concepts. The kidney essence adrenal network, that's my own term. I think it's useful. Adrenal fatigue and hormone deficiencies, spleen qi, and then essential substances like nutritive qi, meaning the part of the blood that carries our nutrients in it. Okay, you guys ready? Part 1. Spleen qi deficiency. All right. Are there any questions or anybody have anything they want to add to that first little, just my introduction? No? Okay. So spleen qi deficiency, the digestive system, and the microbiome. You can see here, earth is the element. It's the center. The color is yellow. It's the digestive system. The spleen is that primary yin organ, that solid organ, right, that is a secretor. But remember, the functional spleen is very different than the spleen that we think about today. And in the center, this is just this Da Vinci thing. It's, again, the spleen controls and provides energy to the muscular system. It's like the center of the body, the digestive center, the microbes, where the nutrition comes from, all of that supports this moving vehicle that we have. I often think of like the center of a village or something where there's this, woman that's there. She's the mother and she's got this big cauldron and it's cooking over the fire and she's in this big center, this tent, whatever it is, this house. Maybe it's brick. I don't know what it is, but she's in there and she's got this pot that's cooking this food. That's bone marrow and all parts of everything that everybody's gathered. And it just has been cooking there for generations and generations. And everybody comes there to get nourished in the center. And then you take that out into the world and that feeds you to go out and do all the things that you do. It's kind of like that's where the spleen is. It's like this central cauldron that's cooking and making all the food digestible for you as an individual. And there's a cultural piece of that, right? Who are you as an individual and then woven into a culture? What do you eat? Why? So this guy, Li Dongyuan, this guy's very interesting, founded the Earth School. This is like 1200 AD. And his story, this is like a war-torn time. So he had a lot of different things that he saw in the people there. Overwork leads to exhaustion and intemperance in eating and drinking, right? So if you eat too much different types of food, cold, raw, fatty, or unclean foods, or too much sweet foods, you start to suffer. And you see it in the digestive system. Remember, they didn't see microbes. They weren't looking at microbes and saying, oh, this guy has H. pylori. They weren't saying that. They were saying, oh, look at these symptoms. Oh, there's a problem with this digestive function in this person's body. How do we support it? Well, we use these materials, right? So etiology of most diseases in his time was a result of injury to the digestive system. I think we could say that for today as well. I think that that's very, very much true today. We are what we eat, digest, absorb, and assimilate, right? Just run through it real quick. Our digestive system, look at that. It's mechanical and it's chemical. You first start digesting food when you think about it. You see the food in front of you and you start cerebral digestion. You've already started digesting it. Then your body starts to make amylase, oral enzymes, to start to break the complex carbohydrates down into smaller ones, simple ones into glucose so that you can start to make energy rapidly. Then you start to stretch the esophagus as the food goes down the tube, right? And that stretch releases gastric hormones like gastrin and hydrochloric acid and pepsin to start the digestive process of taking the large structures, the macromolecules of your food, and then cutting them into smaller bits in the stomach, churning them up so that they become smaller. And then from there, as that acid is working hard to break down things, you have to cool it off. So you buffer it. You have a big pH buffering system right there as you get into the duodenum. That's the bicarbonate. Then you have those duodenal enzymes then start to act, right? And this is like really that center where that cauldron's cooking things into that place where it's so easy to digest them because it's just cooked perfectly. Well, that's what's happening in the center here is these digestive enzymes, these duodenal enzymes and pancreatic enzymes are really refining those macromolecules that have been broken down. Now we need to get them into a really, really refined form so I can just pull them into the bloodstream and they can go right into the tissues and they can make this whole vehicle of mine work really well. That's central spleen function from Chinese medicine, functional spleen, pancreatic and duodenal enzymes. Then the liver and gallbladder release bile, right? It comes down the bile duct out of the hepatobiliary tract from the liver, gets released into the duodenum, emulsifies the fats, starts moving everything down, helps to invigorate the digestive process. Then you've got all kinds of neurotransmitters, like serotonin's a big player, right? In the gut, you've got the neurotransmitters being made by the microbiota there, the dopamine and serotonin, GABA, acetylcholine. They're all, it's made, most of it's made in the gut. Our mind, right? Ileocecal valve, the release of materials from the small intestine to the large intestine. That valve is very important. And then the colonic functions, absorption and excretion. You're pulling in water, salts, some nutrients and things like that, packaging things for release. And on an emotional level, always, what do we want to keep? What do we want to break down into? I have that twice. Anyway, what do we want to break down into smaller bits and make part of us? And what do we want to get rid of, right? Package up and move on. It's good decision-making stuff. So here we have the functional organ networks of the digestive system in the TCM model. Stomach, spleen, right? There's the pancreas and duodenum. Small intestine, large intestine, liver, gallbladder. Primary digestive organs. All of those organs have a role to play in digesting the life experience, both emotionally and physically. Here's the modern spleen. It's a lymph organ. It's a primary lymph organ. It's good to know this stuff too, right? The lymph and lymph vessels, the nodes and organs, the tonsils, the thymus gland, and the spleen, all connected together. Drains protein-containing fluid from the tissue spaces, which escapes from blood capillaries. Transports fats to the blood. Produces lymphocytes and antibodies, right? The chi, right? We're talking about the spleen chi. Filters lymph. Primary functions for defense. Breaking down bacteria, phagocytosing them, grabbing onto them, breaking them down to little bits, taking red blood cells when they get old and recycling them, platelets, taking the iron and the globulin from them and returning that to the blood. Production of lymphocytes, monocytes, and plasma cells. Antibodies, right? Immune function. Stores the blood and releases it through contraction in case of hemorrhage. So that's the modern spleen. So then we go over to the Chinese medicine spleen. And you have this spleen stomach theory, and this is in the data. This has been around for a while now. And this idea that this spleen stomach is this digestive center is not synonymous with the spleen in Western medicine anatomically, physiologically, or pathophysiologically, right? Correlated, not the same. Comprehensive spleen stomach theory involves the digestive system, that vegetative nervous system that I described, immune function, hemopoiesis, right? The blood, hemoglobin, muscle metabolism, endocrine function, the thyroid, adrenal cortex, and medulla, right? So we're talking about the HPA axis, HPTA axis. Hepatic metabolic function, part of that digestive function of the liver. Proteins, nucleotides, energy, water, and salt metabolism. This is sort of like what we translate that spleen stomach theory into like this biomedical, these like little micro, well, let's just say molecules, right? Molecular level assessment. So what does the spleen do in Chinese medicine? Well, it governs the transport and transformation of nutrients from the foods that we eat. Transportation and transformation, that's kind of its fundamental concept. Transform what we eat into useful materials, transport it to where it needs to go. Water and salt absorption governs up and down bearing functions, right? So this is like how the digestive tract works. moving things up, moving things down. And there should be both an upward and downward function. It governs the flesh or the muscles, and really it gives the lift to things. When the spleen qi is deficient, when the spleen energy is weak, everything starts to sink. Diarrhea, bowels start to sink. Toast organs start to move out of their positions. You get these toast kidneys, or you get a retrograde uterus. You can have all kinds of different things where organs start to shift because they're not being held by that energy of the spleen, that central form that gives our muscular structure and holds us in place. That's what this spleen does. Governs the thought and mind and manages the blood. And then if you call it a little bit further in its relationship to the immune system, it's the spleen immune digestive network. Think of it, all those together. It generates blood in essence. Again, it's taking from the essence or from the food that we eat and then dissecting it down and distilling out of it the blood and the essence that we need to keep us going. Houses the spleen qi, right? This force, the life force, kind of the central life force, and it governs all these aspects of immune function: spleen, lymph, immune, digestion, absorption, metabolism, assimilation. So let's go into what are the signs of spleen qi deficiency. And what we just talked about, you could probably have an idea, right? Like this kind of, if you think about it, what would it mean if that spleen was deficient, right? How many of you see patients who come in who say, "Oh, every time I eat, I just get really bloated. My abdomen is full. I just can't get rid of this distension feeling. I don't want to eat anymore. I can't taste things. Doesn't feel good. I get gas after meals," right? This is very common in the clinic today. Loose stools, not formed. That up-bearing function is falling down. The muscles are you're losing the ability to hold things together. Easy bruising. The spleen holds the blood in the blood vessels. When it's weak, you start to bruise easily. Sallow complexion, pale lips. The blood is weak. Why? Because the spleen's not engendering it. The spleen's not building the blood. It's not extracting from what you take in the important essence of that food to nourish the blood. So the blood becomes deficient and you become pale. Pale and swollen tongue. Teeth marks. Teeth marks we'll talk about a little later, because teeth marks is more like a fluid thing, right? The tongue is actually like manifesting this buildup of stagnant fluids in the middle of your body, and you can see it in the tongue as puffiness. Tooth marks. Pale. Again, that lack of blood. Emaciation or puffy appearance. People that seem puffy are literally like, what happened? Are you okay? You're puffy. You look like kind of like, marshmallow kind of color, like texture. Weakness in the arms and the legs or muscles in general. That's what I was saying. It supplies the energy to the muscles to hold you in place, to move you around. So spleen deficiency syndrome can really be broken down into kind of this 3 different classifications. The main one, spleen qi deficiency. Then there's a spleen yang deficiency, which is more like the warming part of the spleen. And then the spleen yin, which is more like the nourishing, moistening part of it. And the diagnostic criteria they all share is this basic stuff, and this is what you want to know. So your patient comes in and they've got poor appetite. My appetite's not good. I get full all the time. I eat food and I'm like immediately full. I just have like 3 bites of food and I'm already full, right? Loose bowel movements, pale, sallow complexion. That's basic. Those are the basic things between all of these that these people will have that shows you that central digestive function is weak. Syndrome differentiation relies on gathering clinical information. Inspect the patient, right? Deep inspection. Listen to them. Listen deeply to their breath. Listen to the sounds that they make. How do they walk? How does their voice sound? Is it weak? Is it strong? Is it deep? Is it high? All the things. Olfaction. Smell them. What do they smell like? Do they smell like tortilla chips? Do they smell like burnt fats? Do they smell sweet? Do they smell kind of foul? What's the smell of the person? That's information. Inquiry. Ask them lots of questions. And the more you get information, the more you ask more information. We always do our Sherlock Holmes thing, right? We're always looking to gather up clues before we have an idea what we're talking about. We want to just keep asking you questions to get deeper till all the clues sort of lay out. And you're like, oh, you've got spleen qi deficiency. Oh, look at that. Clear as day. But I didn't start there. I might have thought that, and then I asked you a bunch of questions, and then the clues came in, and it was clear. But the idea of the Sherlock Holmes thing is don't theorize before you have the facts. It's a capital mistake. You'll make mistakes. So you want to gather the facts first, then make your theory out of them. And then palpation. Feel them. Feel the skin. Feel the tissue. How does it feel? Is it springy? Is it like resistant? Does it bounce back? Or is it kind of squishy? Is it deeply, you press in and it just kind of goes deeper? Like feeling for edema. You press on someone's, tibia. What do you see? Is it pitting? Does it leave the pit there? These are ideas that we can use to kind of help us understand the person, what's happening in their body. So we need all this kind of information. So here's those three patterns. The top one there, you see fatigue, asthenia, right? Just kind of like in a weakened state, atrophied muscle, pale tongue, moderate or weak pulse. The pulse isn't strong and bounding. Spleen yang deficiency, when that yang energy is weak, you got cold limbs, intolerance to cold. God, I just can't get warm. Puffy, pale tongue, slippery coating, and a slow, fine pulse. So the pulse is actually slow with cold conditions. So whenever you're yang deficient, you tend to be cold and you tend to have fluid issues, fluid metabolism, and cold. So cold slows things down, slow pulse. Whereas the other side of it, yin deficiency, you might have a rapid pulse. The pulse might be a little fast. The yin deficiency is associated with heat. This would be deficiency heat in this situation, but dry mouth, low urine output, right? It's fluids are weak. The fluids are deficient. And that's when you start to see this yin deficiency. So when we correlate this with biomed, we see that we have changes that happen at the salivary flow. Remember I talked about, how you start digesting and you get the amylase, your parotid gland starts putting out amylase and digestive enzymes. Well, that gets weak, right? You can have a weak, low amylase activity. It's not happening. This is all correlated. So when a Chinese medical doctor diagnoses someone with spleen qi deficiency, they go in and research what are all the markers associated. And this is what they see, that there's these things, these patterns are associated with spleen qi deficiency pattern. Gastrin and acid secretion goes down. Hypochlorhydria, right? Not having enough hydrochloric acid. You can't break those big macromolecules into little ones. What happens then? You don't digest stuff well. That's that digestive fire of the stomach. Part of that's the spleen qi. Part of that's that spleen yang, the heat there. And we'll show you how to work with that. You lose pancreatic exofunction. The pancreas isn't making, you look at the lipase level. You can test lipase in people. If it's low, their pancreas isn't doing very well. They're not making enough pancreatic enzymes. What does that mean? You just give everybody pancreatic enzymes and then tell them to go home? Well, no, they might need that for a time, especially if they're under some kind of treatment that's damaging. But most of the time you want to use materials, change their diet, change their lifestyle, and change their botanical and nutritional input so that you can actually get that system to work again. You want the pancreas to work well. You want it to do its job of making all these enzymes. If you just keep supplying somebody with pancreatic enzymes, you're not helping their pancreas do the job. You're doing the job for them. Yeah, lipase blood test. Exactly. Yep. Decreased xylose excretion. This is a urine test, and it relates to SIBO, overgrowth of bacteria, and then the duodenal wall breaking down, so you're getting this like leaky gut. GI motility goes down, right? Decreased tone. It's all that muscle. The muscle is weak. Changes in the gastric mucosa. Dysfunction of the mesenteric nervous system, right? Your mind. This is why when people have dementias and things like that, the first place I start looking is what's going on with the gut. Let's get to the gut first. Let's get that straightened out. And that should be a big part of the issue. And if we don't get that fixed up, we're probably not going to get any really good results with the person because remember, their mind is coming from here. So immune changes, low blood lymphocyte counts, decreased muscle metabolism, muscle emaciation, low ATP, right? And increased LDH. LDH is lactic acid dehydrogenase. That's that metabolic acidosis. Your body's making LDH to deal with overproduction of acid. All right, herbs. Any of those look familiar? Yeah, and I'm going to use kind of back and forth between pinyin and then also Latin words, like names of things. So I've tried to put both in most places. This is just starting with the names that we're all most familiar with from the western side of it. Astragalus, Atractylodes, Codonopsis, Panax ginseng, Dioscorea. It's called mountain herb. The jujube date, Poriococcus, and licorice. These are kind of like primary spleen tonic herbs. And there's a spleen tonic formula that's exemplary of this system and how you'd work with it. It combines 4 herbs, the 4 gentlemen. Panax ginseng, which can often be replaced with Codonopsis because it's a lot cheaper. Panax ginseng is a really special herb. It works really well, but it is expensive and it is warming. And so some people feel, can get a little bit too much warming from it, kind of in the system. But it is hard to replace Panax ginseng. It's very special. We'll look at that. Atractylodes, which is there to dry up the dampness and support the spleen. Poriococcus is a mushroom that's a fungus that drains away dampness and so clears away some of the turbidity, helps to work with the soil of the digestive system, supporting the spleen. And then licorice, which is a harmonizer and is tonic for the spleen as well. That basic formula is to tonify the chi of the spleen, strengthen the spleen and stomach. Okay. And a lot of people do really well with this formula as a base, but then you tailor it by adding other herbs to it. Because a lot of people will have this, we're going to go into dampness, this turbid material. You got to get rid of it. So what do we do with this formula? Well, we are promoting absorption and dispersion of nutrients to the body. And again, this is data. This is people that were studied using this formula with spleen deficiency. And then what happened in the body, in the blood? What changes were evaluated by the researchers, right? Cellular immunity, physical strength, and mental activity both go up. Affects immune system, the making of blood circulation, muscle metabolism. You can add astragalus to increase immune function and small intestine muscular tone. What's interesting, you know what the traditional use of astragalus is to lift the body. It lifts the spleen energy. Well, here you see, there it goes. Increases small intestine muscular tone and increases immune function. We often think of astragalus as an immune supportive herb, right? Well, in Chinese medicine, it is a spleen and lung qi tonic. The lung is the source of the wei qi, the defensive qi, the immune system. And then the spleen is the spleen immune digestive system that we just looked at. So it's very well correlated and can restore mitochondrial ultrastructures to near normal. So it can help mitochondrial function. And a lot of these qi tonics, that's what they do. And we'll see that mitochondria and ATP and qi are all closely correlated. So here's ginseng. I love this herb. Person root. I think they called it like man root, but I was like, no, it's person root. It looks like a person. Like you see the root on the left there? A lot of times they'll show like sort of like the exemplary ginseng root, and it's got like the two legs and the torso, and it looks like a person. That's kind of how there's all this doctrine of synergies or what is it, doctor signatures? Yes. Thank you. Signatures. Yeah. And you can see there's, one of them here. Oh, this is really good for people. But beyond that, you can see that it tonifies the source qi. And the source qi is really where the kidney, as the source of essence and the will, meets the spleen, this digestive energy, where you're taking in the nutrition and you're supporting the essence by distilling what you're taking in into its little bits. And you're combining that with the essence that you have in your body to make yourself every day already, which is your pool, which is how much life you have, which is how long you're going to live and how healthy you're going to be, which we're going to talk about on Sunday with my essence talk, because it's really cool. The essence part of the Chinese medicine ties in really well with the genetics idea from modern medicine. And we'll see how those two overlay and how we can weave those two. Calming the shen, tonifying the qi and blood, generate fluids, tonifies the lung, treats impotence. It even improves wisdom. Ginseng. That's one of its Taoist functions. It's sweet, bitter, a little bit warm, enters the lung and spleen, just like astragalus, right? And what is it made of? These saponins, the ginsenosides, notogenosides. These are amazing compounds that have so much data now studying them because they're profoundly influential on human physiology. Polysaccharides, polyenes, and you can see all the different actions here that are, in the research. And there's many more than this, but cholesterol, anti-catabolic, building up the anabolic reserve in the body, enhancing the immune system, combating leukopenia, improve memory and learning. It's one of these herbs that just sort of everybody could take when you hit like 35 years old. And that's the idea in Taoist medicine, is like, just take this every day. Just take this every day and it'll just help you. It'll just help you resist the forces of aging. So here's some dosing for you. Okay. Check it out with Panax ginseng. And remember, some people who are already really hot, especially like if you're, if you're a menopausal woman and you have a lot of heat in your body, you need to nourish the yin. You need to cool the heat down. So you got to be careful giving someone a real warming herb like this, because it can be a little bit, aggravating to the warming part of their body already. So always take that into account. Again, we don't give it to 14-year-olds very often unless they were really, really failing to thrive. If there was someone who was really weak and emaciated and just couldn't get it together because of whatever reason, genetics or some other thing, yeah, they could take ginseng. It's great for a kid in that case. But most of the time, 14-year-old boy does not need ginseng. They're waking up every day excited. They've got, heat in their body. They've got acne. There's like heat coming out of them all the time. And so you don't want to give them ginseng. but you give them herbs to move the liver and to cool them down and to, release toxins. But you can see here, look at this, for severe collapse of source qi, hemorrhagic shock. Someone just really needs that spleen to just grab a hold of that. Like we saw even the modern spleen, right? That clamps down the blood vessels to prevent the hemorrhage. But someone who's in shock, sometimes after a stroke, after big surgeries, people are just really depleted. Well, the microbiota is totally blown out. The digestive center is really weakened. Anesthesia is very hard on the body. And the shock that happens has to be countered with something like this. And for severe collapse of the source qi, 15 to 30 grams a day. Just, really big doses of the whole herb. And you can, of course, use extracts and things. You just have to kind of do the math. But you can see here, tincture, 0.5 to 3 milliliters. Good doses. Powder, 0.5 to 1 gram. That's like a 5 to 7 to 1 extract, something like that. Those are just your everyday doses in a formula. So, like I said, Codonopsis is often the replacement for Renshen, for ginseng, because it's not heating and it's much cheaper. So for most people, it's easy to get. It still does a good job. It's a really interesting root, similar. It's sweet. It's got a little bit of the same properties, spleen and lung. Tonifying, nourishes the blood, restores constitution, tonifies qi, strengthens the middle jiao. Middle jiao is the digestive center. So it does all the same kind of things. It's got codonopsinine, alkaloids, saponins, all these different kind of molecules in it. Remember, plants are very complex, right? This is why pharmacy has such a hard time with them. It's because they're very complex mixtures of many, many things. And they do many, many different things to the body. They don't do one thing. That's why we don't have plants. That's why they're not patented. Nobody can patent a plant, right? And so you don't study it. You don't want to study it. It's dirty. It's got all this stuff. It doesn't do what I want it to do. It does its own thing. So we don't get to have data on plants like we do with drugs. It's one of the things that people say, well, there's no data to support this. It's like, well, actually, there's a lot of data to support it, just not the kind of data that you're looking for in a single molecule, single target. That's not what we do with these. So dosing, again, you can go pretty big with this. And 30 grams is fine dose for a day. Whole herbs, generally 6 to 14 grams in a formula per day. Tincture 1 to 4. And you can dry fry the herb. Chinese medicine does all these things. It'll cook it in honey. You'll fry something dry in a pan. You can combine it with vinegar. You can do multiple different steps of preparations for things, combining it with ginger and cooking it. There's all different ways to prepare herbs that change the effect. So when someone has diarrhea, where their spleen is really deficient and the energy is falling out, you can really help to pull that up using the Codonopsis, and you dry fry it. Licorice. Love this herb. Spleen, stomach, lung, and heart. Look what it does. Tonifies the spleen, benefits the qi, moistens the lung, stops the cough. Harmonizes other herbs, treats poisoning. It's a really great herb for all around just supporting and harmonizing digestion. And I'll say one thing about this herb. People often get scared of it because there's these stories about people's blood pressure going up when they take licorice, right? People come in, I can't take licorice, it'll raise my blood pressure. Well, there is a thing. It's called pseudo-hyperaldosteronism. And it's where in certain people that are very sensitive to fluids, they're very sensitive in their aldosterone system, which the mineralocorticoids that direct sodium retention or excretion and then water retention. And it's very rare. And you'll see that in the data around licorice and people's blood pressure, almost all the cases are people either eating licorice candy in large amounts. And you just go to PubMed and look it up. You'll see, licorice raises blood pressure. Yeah, a woman ate 3, bags of Twizzlers and her blood pressure went up. Yeah, that's not taking a formula with licorice in it. These are not compatible things at all. We put licorice in almost all the Chinese medicine formulas. Small amounts as a harmonizer. It brings things together. It supports the digestion. So think of it that way. Small amounts are very helpful. And then if you want to use it as an herb, and in bigger amounts, I often use it when people have sodium deficiency. Because one of the things that licorice does is it helps spare sodium. It also spares cortisol and cortisone. It helps you maintain your levels of stress hormones. Yes? Chronic hyponatremia, it's great for that. And I'll actually use it with like sea salt, electrolytes, and licorice tincture all together. Take it with, the sea salt taken with the licorice. Licorice will help to spare the sodium. So it literally reduces sodium excretion. People get scared of the glyceric acid because it is very powerful. It inhibits the 11-beta steroid dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that breaks down your cortisol and cortisone. So that's how it maintains them. But it's actually a really beautiful plant. It just needs to be used appropriately. Look at all these actions. So many beautiful things. There's that mineralocorticoid effect, sodium retention. anti-inflammatory, antiarrhythmic. So don't be afraid of it. Just learn about it and use it appropriately. That's just generally the case. Dosage, smaller doses, 1.5 to 12 grams. There's one formula called it's licorice and peony decoction, and it's just white peony, Baishao, and licorice, and it's for muscle spasms, for any kind of muscle cramping and things like that. It works really well. It's 1-to-1, those two plants. Exceptional cases, 15 to 30 grams again. If you really need to get in there, if you have really severe cramping or really severe sodium deficiency, you can dry fry with honey. Makes it more warming, more tonifying. And here's just a little thing about using herbs. As we talked about spleen qi deficiency, we kind of get through this idea that we want to tonify the spleen. You've got to first address whether there's excess or deficiency, because we're talking about spleen qi deficiency, but we're going to look at dampness and phlegm dampness, and those are excesses. Those are things that have built up. And so when someone has a buildup of stuff in their digestive system, you can't just tonify them. Tonifying them is giving them stuff. If you give them stuff and they have too much stuff, they're going to have more stuff. So if you see that they're weak and they're deficient, but they also have a buildup of stuff, meaning dampness and stickiness and cholesterol imbalance and glucose and insulin signaling problems, you've got to clear that out too. If you don't clear it out and you just tonify them, you could be too cloying, too sticky, too much rich stuff, and then they just actually wouldn't get better and they get worse. So you can't just say, I've got spleen qi deficiency, I'll give them all, Sejun Zatong, 4 gentlemen. Can't do that. But what you can do is, if that's your base formula and someone has some dampness, then you're going to add some herbs to it, and I'll show you how to do that. And that's a Dui Yao, combining herbs, 2 herbs together. You always use formulas. So here's another example of a great qi tonic formula from Chinese medicine that you can create through your own herbal pharmacy or your dispensary easily. You combine astragalus with Panax ginseng, atractylodes, the glycyrrhiza, the licorice, and then you add some angelica as well, which nourishes the blood, and then you get this formula. Astragalus and angelica, together they build the blood really well, because angelica is the primary blood tonic, and then astragalus is the primary qi tonic. So you're tonifying the qi and the blood together. And like I said, if the spleen qi, the digestion, can't do its job of distilling things down to the refined parts, you can't nourish the blood, so the blood becomes weak. So in order to tonify the blood, you often have to support the digestion. Does that make sense? Yes.
I don't know if it's a little not on topic, but in relation to the spleen, and I understand, Western spleen versus Chinese medicine spleen concept. If someone has had a splenectomy due to a car accident, how does that affect, in the traditional Chinese medicine eyes, the spleen in that regard?
Not very much. The question is, if someone had a car accident, for example, and they had a hemorrhagic spleen and they had the spleen removed, how would that affect the Chinese medicine spleen idea? And that's kind of what I try to put the corollary up there, because there's a lymph aspect to it. There is a red blood cell element to it. There is, there's a lot of things that are tied, but really the Chinese functional spleen is really like, pancreatic enzyme function, duodenal enzyme function, liver and gallbladder digestive function, stomach breakdown. It's all that stuff. So it doesn't really do much to change it. Like when someone loses their gallbladder, they still have a gallbladder channel. There's still all the energy still moving through the same pathways in the body. It's just that they don't have that organ, so they don't concentrate their bile. The liver just drips bile directly into the duodenum. It changes things a little bit, but it's not a big deal. You notice an herb in here, there's citrus, which is a great damp relieving herb. So this is where you're getting into this is a lifting formula. Like the astragalus is for like diarrhea, loose stools, and someone just can't get their spleen to lift. They're losing organ function. They're starting to have a drop in their muscle energy. Everything's like sinking, the sinking of their qi. This is a lifting formula. Astragalus lifts, and then look at that, Semicifuga racemosa, right? Yeah, black cohosh, used to lift the energy. And the Shengma is the Chinese name. So it's used here with the astragalus to give that lifting function. And then there's bupleurum also, which is also a lifting herb. It's also a liver qi moving herb. It soothes the liver and smooths liver energy flow. So it kind of helps with that liver, when the liver anger, frustration, blockage, damage starts to act up on the spleen and stomach. So here's astragalus. Strengthens the wei qi. Tonifies the spleen and lung. Raises the yang energy. Strengthens the exterior, so preventing you from getting infections, right? They always thought of astragalus as a great herb to use on the daily to tonify someone's spleen, immune, digestive network, and to keep them from getting sick. Don't take it when you first are getting a fever. That's not the idea. The idea is take it beforehand. Echinacea is similar that way. It's very similar to echinacea. Echinacea is a building herb. It's a tonic herb. It's not supposed to be taken like to try to get rid of a cold. You do that differently. When you want to get rid of a cold or a fever, you work with plants that are diaphoretics, that vent and release and help your immune system get to this point where it gets rid of the pathogen, not strengthens it and tonifies it, because you can tonify the pathogen too. Promotes tissue regeneration, can resolve edema, although edema, you got to find the cause of the edema first. Here's chemicals. I'm going to talk about this one. There's one astragaloside called cycloestragenol that's really interesting. And obviously it's part of the whole complex, but you see biomedical actions of the whole astragalus. And sometimes I'll use as big a dose as 90 grams in a day with Angelica for folks undergoing chemotherapy that have really deficient white blood cells and red blood cells. When you combine astragalus and Angelica, it's called Angelica decoction to build the blood. It's 5 parts astragalus to 1 part Angelica, and it's really beautiful, and it works really well to build. But the astragalus part of it is that white blood cell part increases the erythropoietin, protects the kidneys, the liver, prevents colds and flus, improves rectal prolapse, right? Prolapsed organs, toast organs, that's that spleen deficiency. And here's cycloestragenol. There's actually a formula. Dr. McKee works with this company called Life Plus, and they have a formula called Discovery. It's been around for a while now, like, I don't know, 10 years or something, but it's cycloestragenol, and it really strongly does improve tissue damage. It improves the telomerase activity, so it helps to preserve the telomeres, so it protects them, especially in people that are really getting hit hard by treatments or chronic disease. It can be a really helpful thing. But it's cool to see, we start extracting these parts of plants, and I always give it with astragalus too when I'm using it. So I always want to combine any isolate or extracted part of a plant. I want to combine it with the whole plant to make it all work better. Dosing, here you go. Big doses, 45 to 90. Most of the time, 9 to 30. Tincture, 2 to 5. Tinctures, I don't like tinctures as much when you have like mushrooms that are polysaccharide rich, or astragalus, which is polysaccharide rich. Those are water soluble components. So I like powders a lot better. And here's a really cool idea. Futsa Lijiang. Futsa is aconite. We're going to talk about that. It's the coldest herb in Chinese or in Western medicine, right? So it's Aconitum napellus, which is the monk's hood, right? It's a very toxic herb in modern medicine, or I should say in eclectic pharmaceutical botanical medicine, where aconite actually, is so cold in its nature that it just shuts down the nerve impulse, and you can kill someone pretty easily if you give them too much Aconite napellus. Well, Aconite carmichaeli is the Chinese version, and what the Chinese did is they took the chemical part of it that was the cold part of it out. So they cook it for a couple hours, and they pull off this foam that comes off of it. And that's the element that creates the cold, the nerve blocking action. And what's left is the hot part, very hot, the hottest thing we have. And it's like the hottest herb that we have in Chinese medicine. So interesting how it's the coldest herb, but it becomes the hottest herb. And what it does, it warms the yang, dispels cold, tonifies qi, strengthens the spleen. And the formula that I wanted to show you guys is dried ginger, which is very hot. Fresh ginger is warming, but dried ginger just concentrates it, so it's even hotter. You got ginseng, that's another warming, activating qi tonic. Atractylodes. Then you've got the aconite, the prepared aconite, futsa, and then you've got a little bit of licorice to balance the thing out. That's really for that yang deficient type of stomach, where they've got all that stuff, the appetite problems, the digestion, the kind of like the fullness after the meals, the gas, all the things. But they also have the cold limbs, the aversion to cold, that kind of, I just can't get warm kind of feeling. You look for cold signs, and then that's where you start using this formula. This is from Heiner Fruhoff. I worked with Heiner a bit at the NCNM back when I was in school, like around the early 2000s up in Portland. And he uses one particular futsa from the fire school that his company that he created called Classical Pearls. They make amazing Chinese medicine formulas. If you don't know about it, Classical Pearls is really great. Organic herbs grown in their natural climates. But this thing is that they do this futsa in the right way, the way it was meant to be done. I don't know any other futsa out there that's the same as this. And according to Heiner, you can't replace this herb with anything else. And he uses it in a lot of formulas. It not only activates the yang energy, but it actually brings the yang back into a state of storage. So it actually can return the yang, the heating force, The thing that was, remember that cauldron I talked about, where at the center, like where you're just like, you're breaking down the food into this perfect broth soup that's just already ready. You don't have to digest it. You just take it. It just goes in right into your blood. The fire underneath that, that's what this does. This heats up the fire that cooks the pot, that keeps it warm. Opens the 12 channels, drives out pain, treats severe insomnia, severe heart and kidney issues. The heart needs a lot of yang energy, but it can also need yin. You got to make sure you know which way you're going with that. But when the kidney yang is deficient, the heart will suffer. It's water and fire. And then from Heider's perspective, people who have really big anxiety and insomnia, sometimes if they're fearful, it's actually more between the kidney and the heart. The kidney yang needs to get anchored. They need to get the strength back because the fear, the anxiety, the destabilization in the kidney system is what's driving the heart into its palpitations and its uncontrollable anxious feelings. So in order to calm it down, you could use Sisyphus, the formula called Swan's Renton, use Sisyphus to calm the heart. But if you don't give it that fire and strengthen the kidney underneath it, it doesn't really work that well. So he found that if you combine the two together, you anchor the yang, then people really get good results with insomnia and anxiety. 3 primary patterns. Sometimes when the qi is really weak, people get fevers like that. This is really good for that. Sinking of the middle burner qi. Again, I described that, kind of everything sinking down. This is really just restoring the fire. Harmonizers, ginger, jujube date, and licorice. They're great to just put in your formulas. Whenever you're doing digestive work, little bits of this stuff goes a long ways to help people absorb, digest, make sure the formula is really usable by the person. This makes the formula work for them. Mushrooms are really great. You know, they're bioremediators. This is Ganoderma. I put in here the spirit mushroom, right? Lingzhi. Tonifies the qi, nourishes the yin and blood, strengthens spleen and stomach, calms the mind and the shen. Combine it with ginseng, astragalus, and angelica for qi deficiency due to overstrain. Overstrain? Anybody experience that at all these days? Anybody feel anything? No? Yeah. Combine it with Sisyphus to calm the mind. And you could put Fu Ling up here. You could put, Tremides. You could put Chaga, Inonotus up here. You could put a number of, cordyceps. They'll all work in a similar way, but each of them has its own kind of specific aspects. Reishi is really good in general. Works with the spirit. It's actually spirit mushroom. Ling Zhi was the character. Zhi is mushroom, and Ling is the character for spirit. And actually, the character originally was 2 people sitting under a tree praying for rain. That was the original character for spirit. Make sure you get good therapeutic grade Ganoderma. It should be grown on its natural media. Never get mycelium grown on grain. I was even talking with the guy, Jeff Chilton, who started the company Namex, North American Medicinal Mushroom Extracts. It's my favorite material. He does everything really, really well. Traditional extraction, grown on their traditional media, grown in China, at least 100 kilometers from any, toxic place. Really cool stuff. But I was like, well, for people that want, they want to real inexpensive kind of, it could even be like a food grade thing. He's like, no, don't do it. Don't grow mycelium on grain in an autoclave bag. That's not how you do it. None of the data supports that. Sure, there's polysaccharides in there. Sure, there's beta-glucans in there. There's beta-glucans in starch. There's beta-glucans in rice. You're looking at the content of beta-glucans. Beta-glucans from mushrooms they're non-symmetrical. They're asymmetrical beta-glucans. So they interact with the immune system, acting as actually mitogens. They signal the immune system to become active. But rice doesn't do that. 3 to 6 grams a day. Make sure you've got polysaccharides and triterpenes. That's just one for you guys to have. Just take that home, use it when you're clinic, and just give this to your patients. Things they can do. Tonify the spleen, right? Chew your food. Slow down. When you're eating, focus on eating. When you're sitting in the little, the central tent in the village with the woman who's been cooking the food there, just sit with her and be with her and eat the food and don't think about anything else. That's how you nourish yourself. Calm the mind. People watch TV. They read a book. They read the paper while they're eating. No, that's not stop all that. Just sit down and eat. It's so important. So good. NSAIDs can disrupt the GI lining, right? Because, they inhibit cyclooxygenase to reduce inflammation. But remember, inflammation is part of healing. And so if you reduce your inflammation through the COX pathway, then you don't make the prostaglandins that tell your body to build the gut lining. So your gut lining starts to break down. So if you do have people taking NSAIDs, what do you give them? Demulcents. You give them gut lining, mucous membrane forming, juicy stuff. Can be like brown seaweed. It can be slippery elm, marshmallow, licorice, aloe, you name it. But they need to take that with the NSAIDs. Calm the central nervous system. Exercise. You can all just kind of hang out with that on your own. Get down with it. So the microbiota inhabit the soil. We talked about this a lot. And I want to just make sure we understand we're working with the soil. We want to work with the soil, not with, the individual bugs. I'm not so much about like killing a bug or making you have more of a bug. I want to change the soil so that the bugs that live there are the ones that support you, that are in tune with you, right? The collective genome of our microbiota, the microbiome, encodes 100 times more genes than the human biome or human genome. So there's 100 times more genes of other organisms in your body than you. That's just basic knowledge now? No big deal? Okay. I mean, that's cool. Yeah. You're like, yeah, I know all that stuff. Yeah. I'm just like, when you sit there and think about it, I'm like, wow, wait a minute. What am I? I thought I was a human. I'm like a, I don't know, I'm a micro generator. I'm a big micro organism. I don't know what I am. Anyway, it's it's chaos, right? And then it's this complexity, and then this all these things coming together to create this emergent structure of me and you, right? But there's a lot of pieces to it all. Infinite diversity spans the tree of life. And the thing here is that there's no like ideal human microbiome. We can't like say, we found out what the ideal human microbiome is. We're going to give you the pill. Here it is. This is going to make you have the ideal human microbiome. It doesn't exist. That's not how it is. Each of us has our own unique microbiome. That's a part of who we are, who we think, our physical body, everything. And the most resilient place we can be is with diversity, a diverse microbiome. And remember, giving people probiotics, they don't like go in and like set up new biofilms in your body. The biofilms are all along the inside of your intestines, and they're deep weavings of all these colonies of different microbes that are all living together. When you take in probiotics, I think of them more as targeted antibiotics. They'll compete with resource, acquisition with other microbes, but they're not going to go in and just replace what you've already got there. You got to change the soil to change what grows there. You follow me? Sort of? Okay. Lots of things live there. 35,000 bacterial species, probably more than that now, 40,000, who knows? Lots. And there's archaea, fungi, yeasts, viruses, protozoans, helminths, and they all have a role to play. There can be commensal, meaning eat at the same table, we share. They can be symbionts, right? They can, we can have a mutual symbiotic relationship. They can be parasitic. They can be sucking something from us. And sometimes it's hard to define what they really are, but they're there. Bacteria, super important, right? Control pH, digest proteins and carbohydrates. They help us manufacture vitamins, essential fatty acids. They work with our immune system, the GALT. Breakdown of bacterial toxins, convert flavonoids into anti-tumor and anti-inflammatory factors. We need them. Essential. So the gut-activated immune system, two conflicting functions, right? It's got to tolerate the microbiota, but it's also got to control the microbiota to prevent overgrowth. It's got to be in the perfect relationship. So the whole idea is to modulate the immune response to make it so the tolerance and the control is in balance. And one of the things we do is we use the secretory immunoglobulin A. You guys know that one? Sig A. You can look at this. It's often tested in stool samples now. First line of defense for the GI mucosa. It's actually the most abundant immunoglobulin that we make in our bodies. It's how we control the microbiota. It's the immunoglobulin that we use to control them. Binds to the antigenic epitopes on the invading microorganisms. And you got to have L-glutamine to make it. Okay? So L-glutamine is our exemplary spleen nutrient. So when people are spleen deficient, glutamine is the most powerful nutrient to tonify them. This is just that, looking at the nervous system, 500 billion neurons, direct CNS communication, uses more than 30 known neurotransmitters. Do you think my whole idea about the mind and the gut has got some traction, maybe? Maybe? Okay. Some people, maybe. Maybe I'm just crazy. Gut-brain axis, constant bidirectional communication, right? So the brain is communicating with the gut brain in this constant dialogue. And that's just so beautiful. That's that Chinese medicine spleen and the mind. Neural, endocrine, immune, and humoral links. Pretty much everything that we do is influenced to some degree by the microbiota. And I love this bottom statement here. This is, this research in 2015 says that during evolution, micro-brain interactions critically influenced brain evolution towards the development of the social brain. Well, not only am I made up of this, I'm like a biont, right, of all these microorganisms, but they're actually wanting to get together and share and exchange relationships with each other through me. So they're influencing what I do so that they actually are able to evolve and change and have interactions, right? It's pretty interesting. So how do we test the microbiota? Well, we do stool testing mainly, right? We can look for things like leukocytes, blood, fat, sugars, pancreatic enzymes, pH, infectious causes, right? Of course, looking at bacteria, viruses, parasites. Lots of different labs out there today. And the question is, are they accurate? And the interesting thing is that stool analyses may not provide consistent results with both false positive and false negative results possible. And there's some interesting data now where people are starting to study, which ones are the best ones. Most recently, there was a study that compared a number of them, like the GI map and GI effects and a couple others. And GI effects seemed to be the best overall accuracy in that study. I do use the stool sample studies often, but again, I think if you combine with the symptom picture and you really get clear and you're using botanical medicine to change the soil, you can do great work and not have to worry so much. But if you're just trying to, do like a dot to dot kind of paint by the numbers thing, you got to be careful because you might think the person has H. pylori and they don't, or you might think that they have, Campylobacter, but they don't. The parasites are pretty accurate. It's more like the bacteria populations. It's hard to know how accurate they are. So just be careful when you're doing that testing. And then when we think about looking at the stool, back in the day, back in antiquity, I think we didn't have stool samples. We couldn't send it into the hospital or whatever to the lab. So the doctor might have actually, can you bring in your stool for me? Bring in some urine too? I'll smell it. I'll look at it. We'll examine it. We'll check it out, right? And you look at it. Well, what's the color? What's the consistency? What's the quantity? What's the shape? What does it smell like? Is there blood there? Mucus? Does it float? All those things are interesting parts of the story to tell us what's happening with the digestive system, right? And the microbiota. So I'm just going to step into part 2 just by talking about dampness. This is where you have the spleen qi. It's deficient. And when it's deficient, it doesn't digest things well. So you get a buildup of stuff, right? And that stuff we're talking about here is dampness. That's the Chinese term for it. Now you've got the bloating, the gas, the distension, cramping, fullness, heartburn, and regurg after meals. The stuff's making a buildup of material going up into your esophagus. Your energy's getting low. You're getting heaviness. Dampness is heavy. It's like, God, I don't really want to do anything. I'm just feeling, and then foggy headedness. Oh, the mind, right? The mind isn't clear. There's all this extra stuff in the digestive system. And then the spleen qi and the mitochondria, where the mitochondria is really controlling the physical currency of qi, the ATP, the energy that drives physiological processes, giving that lift to the body. And when you have the dampness and that turbid material, you get congestion and sluggish function. So it's like it's a cycle that generates itself. The more spleen deficient you are, the more damp you get. And the more damp you are, the more spleen deficient you get. So you've got to treat both sides of it. Over worry and spleen deficiency makes the digestive system more susceptible to dampness and turbidity. So here's another one of these things, these little summaries, right? Harmonize the center. Apply the lifestyle and diet. Use harmonizing formulas. Control potentially damaging acidification. Soothe, protect tissues. Regulate microbiota. Calm the nervous system. Identify the constitutional pattern. Apply individualized treatment. Combine formulas for effectiveness. Easy, right? You guys got this, right? Good. So I wanted to mention neutralizing cordials because they're just so cool, right? Functional restorative agent for addressing GI upset. Broad group of symptoms. And this is eclectic medicine stuff, right? Neutralizing cordials, right? Highly prized because they were good for dyspepsia, heartburn, gastritis, diarrhea, constipation. This is from Ellingwood, right? One of our great eclectic pharmacists, herbalists, doctors. A sour stomach is always benefited by it. Specifically when the tongue is coated uniformly white, dampness. Broad and the mucous membranes are pale, spleen deficiency. When there are eructations of sour gas or vomitings of acid matter, everything's moving upward, right? That upward, downward bearing motion never fails in these cases. It makes no difference whether there's diarrhea or constipation. A stomach filled with sour, decomposed food can appropriate no medicine, and all specific remedies demand a stomach free from these conditions. And this is something that in Chinese medicine is also called food stagnation, or it can also be called middle jiao qi stagnation, where the energy of this area is just not flowing. And part of that's that dampness, the phlegm, the buildup of stuff, and the deficiency of function. It has no superior as a restorative to acute abnormal conditions of the stomach or bowels demanding an antacid. So much better than antacids. Really helpful for helping people if they want to get off of proton pump inhibitors, right? They want to get off of Prilosec, or they want to get off of pantoprazole, something like that. You could help them by getting them on neutralizing cordials and, helping them reduce their doses. It's rhubarb, golden seal. Those are the cold bitters that are clearing. Cinnamon, warming. Refined sugar. Oh, that's interesting, right? A lot of sugar, 4 pounds. A gallon of brandy, right? Oil of peppermint. This is a big batch here. Yeah, this is a big batch. Yeah. This is Dr. King's cordial, right? So this is like this, it's kind of like the pound cake, right? You got a pound of eggs, a pound of flour, a pound of sugar, and a pound of milk. Gallon. Yeah, gallon of milk, pound of flour, dozen eggs, right? So here's the cordial synergy. Turkey rhubarb and essential oil of peppermint act as tonics. Potassium bicarbonate, that's the neutralizing part to neutralize the acid. Cinnamon bark for the warming astringent properties. It's calming, stimulating, improves digestion, facilitates nutrient absorption, and enhances nutrient assimilation. And then just sugar, basically, that sweet flavor is the biggest tonic to the spleen system. So when you want to tonify the spleen, you want sweet. Sometimes people are really weak and deficient. You just want to give them plain rice. Just plain rice is just so good and just gentle and nourishing. But most people are kind of like have too much stuff, too much dampness. So you got to be really careful. You don't want to give someone with a lot of dampness a bunch of sugar. It'll just make them more damp, more sticky. It feeds the digestive tract. So most of the microbes live on sugar. They love sugar. They'll give you dopamine all day. You're like, I feel good, man. Like, yeah, eat some ice cream. I feel really good. Yeah. Dopamine flood, right? That's coming from the microbes making dopamine in response to what you give them. So you got to switch it over to make the bugs that make you feel good when you don't give them sugar, but you give them broccoli. Those are the bugs that we want to, really engender. Too much is a buildup of dampness, right? And overgrowth can happen. So if you have, SIBO, if you have a lot of overgrowth and you give sugar, it'll just make everything grow, and it's the wrong thing to do. So modern variation, just you can put things like chamomile in there, which works with the mind and the digestion. Lemon balm. You've got like essential oils of fennel, ginger, peppermint. Here's just like a modern variation on that formula. This is part 2. So we're moving on from that spleen deficiency and then that buildup of stuff, to use that wonderful scientific term, into the phlegm dampness, which is even a stickier, more hard to get rid of, and more detrimental type of material buildup. And we'll talk about metabolic syndrome, a little bit on cell membranes and fatty acids. Okay, so we talked about dampness and sweet, and I talked about sugar, and so that sweet flavor tonifies. You get too much of it, you get stagnation. Too much tonification gets to stagnation. So our voracious appetite for all things sweet and tonifying has begun to erode our quality of life. Now we're seeing firsthand how too much of a good thing can be not good, right? Turbidity. Body fluids turning into dampness, which is this sort of sticky, not clear material. And then that gives way to phlegm, which is a thicker, more sticky material. Sugar and fat-making machinery. So when we start to build phlegm and dampness, you'll see it starts to change the way that our tissue actually is, like what it's made of. It starts to change. The machinery in our body shifts. So we become more well-designed for the building of adipocytes, of more fat, and doing more and more storage. It's a cyclical thing where we'll start to store more and more. What are the characteristics of dampness? Well, stickiness, heaviness, things will go down, right? We lost that lift. Causes repeated attacks. It's kind of like, it's very chronic. It's hard to get rid of. Infuses downward. Clinical manifestations, heaviness in the body or the head. Loss of appetite. Feeling of fullness in the chest or epigastrums. That's materials building up. Difficulty in urination. You've started to mess with the fluid metabolism in the kidney and the genitourinary tract. Sticky discharge. The tongue coat starts to get sticky and thick. Slippery or soggy pulse. This pulse starts to be slippery with dampness. So when you get spleen qi deficiency with dampness, here's those symptoms again. Bloating, gas. I would say, bloating, gas, cramping, fullness, distension, heartburn, acid regurg. Always ask that little set with people right away. Primarily after eating. and again, this is the deficiency stuff, right? So after you eat, you can tell like this is really deficiency. And a lot, people used to always say, do the hydrochloric acid thing. You can give people, betaine hydrochloride, right? Where you give them hydrochloric acid bound to trimethylglycine. They take that, and then that's just basically provides that initial hydrochloric acid bolus that your body would produce with its normal spleen yang function. We're just, hey, here comes some food, make hydrochloric acid, break it down, we're going. But if it doesn't work, then the idea is that the whole system doesn't get triggered to move. All the systems below that hydrochloric acid signal don't go, and the molecules that should be broken down don't get broken down. They're bigger when they get to the enzymes. The enzymes don't do enough work, and then you get this partially digested food, and you get this problem. So one of the treatments was to either take apple cider vinegar before meals to increase your hydrochloric acid production. Take a tablespoon before each meal. It works really well. You could also take hydrochloric acid, tablets before meals. And those are okay to do as long as your ultimate goal is to solve the problem of the spleen deficiency with the dampness. So here is the 6th gentleman. So like I said, combining herbs. So we had our 4 gentlemen, right? You guys remember what that is? That was the ginseng or Codonopsis, right? With the Tractylodes and the Poria mushroom and the licorice. Now you've added the chen pea, the citrus peel, and the banxia, the pinelia, in order to really resolve that dampness, to get some strong aromatic action to resolve the dampness, the stuff, while you're building the spleen qi. Got to do those things together. And there's some, these are just ratios for your dosing. You can use kind of whatever dose you feel is right. You want to adjust things based on the presentation. Strengthens the spleen, transforms phlegm, dries dampness, stops vomiting, directs the qi downward, removes obstruction in the middle burner, and resolves phlegm dampness. Phlegm dampness is where we're going. This is Mu Xiang, which is this is another variation to the 6 gentlemen. So you had the 4 gentlemen, now you've got the 6. Then you add Xiang Sha, which adds 2 herbs. Mu Xiang, which is really aromatic. You go to any Chinese herb pharmacy, you'll smell this. Like if there's Mu Xiang, it's really like one of the big smells. Like, wow, that's really strong. It's very aromatic, and aromatic dries dampness. One of the doctors, when I was in China studying at the House of Celebrity Doctors in Nanjing, he said, you can use like heat to dry things, but a lot of times you don't want to heat things to dry them because it actually damages them. They don't want to be heated. You got to be careful with heat. So what you use breeze, you use wind to dry things. He said it's like you put your clothes out to dry, and if it's sunny out, they'll dry fast in the sun, but they might get a little crispy. When you put them outside and there's a nice breeze, they dry really easily. So this is like drying dampness with a breeze. It's like using the breeze rather than the heat. And that's important because we don't want to heat people up when they're hot. We want to dry them off without heating them. And then the sha ren, that's the amomum, which is like a Chinese cardamom. It's like this red cardamom, like this big cardamom seed, really aromatic. And it makes it more dampness resolving and more qi regulating, moves that stagnation. And then you have another variation is called Huanglian Liu Junzitong, which is coptis. That's Huanglian. So it adds coptis, which is a berberine-rich plant. Indefinable epigastric discomfort. Oh God, I just can't get rid of this feeling of just pressure up here. It's really good for that. And it clears damp heat. We're going to talk about damp heat a little bit because that's another variation on this whole thing. And it promotes tissue regeneration. So really good for ulcers and, H. pylori infection, but berberine is really helpful. Coptis is really good. I always give it to people when they travel too. They've got this tea pill called Huanglian Su 1. It's just coptis in a tea pill. And if you have like food that you're not sure about or whatever, you can just take it. It can really help to clear things out. But if people are really deficient, if their spleen is really weak, you can't give them a lot of bitter. Like too much bitter and cold will deplete their spleen more. So you have to use it in balance and combine it with other things. Here's some more dampness transforming herbs. A good list, right? Atractylodes. This is another Atractylodes. It's called Atractylodes lancea. Sangju. It's even more aromatic, really transforming. There's that amomum. Huoxiang, Pogosamon. Do you guys know what that is? That's patchouli. Peilon, another one that's really aromatic. Eupatorium. And then you can see these are right below that is qi regulators for the middle jiao. Citrus, transforming phlegm. There's the Muxiang, the Aucklandia, that moves that middle jiao qi, and then the intestines moves the qi in the blockages in that digestive system. The Rhizoma cyperus regulates the liver qi to make it move easy and to take the liver's pressure off of the digestive system. And then mint just Mint is really great. Here's aromatic spices. It's a good list for you. Because I give this to patients when I'm like, you have a dampness issue. Why don't you just, I'll give you the herbs and all the things, but then try to use these on your own at home. Get them. Have them around. Use them in your food. Foods for the damp spleen. This is the list that I've kind of come to. There's lots of lists out there, but you can see most of it is mild, bland, right? Bland foods are generally a little bit draining to dampness and supportive without being too nourishing and too tonifying, so they don't make it cloying and sticky. They're also not too hot. They're not too spicy. So they just take it really easy. They're easy to digest and supportive of the spleen. So let's go to metabolic syndrome. And you can see that in this data, with people that have metabolic syndrome, in this study, 29% of them had something called phlegm dampness syndrome, and 18% of them had spleen qi deficiency. So they're taking these 9 constitutional types identified in Chinese medicine and then overlaying them on folks that have been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome and then saying, well, what's the correlation? Oh, there it is. 29% of them had phlegm damp syndrome. That's a big number when you think about a big study. Correlations, associations, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis, right? So here's this proposed pathological path of obesity. Adipocyte hypertrophy. What does that mean? It means you're just building a lot of fat cells. Lipotoxicity, they call it in Chinese medicine, fei du. Insufficient blood circulation in adipose tissues. So in the fatty tissues, it's not like normal vasculature. It doesn't have this big flow. It's more stagnant and it's hypoxic. There's low oxygen there. Hypoxic fat cells are apoptotic and necrotic. They're kind of folding in on themselves at some point. There's no blood supply there. There's no oxygen there, right? Tissue fibrosis with insufficient blood vessel formation. It's not the most happy, healthy tissue. Chronic low-grade inflammation, insulin resistance, where there's an increase in blood glucose and blood lipid levels. And when you have that, this is when you get into this insulin resistance picture, where you start to have all kinds of problems associated, including cancer and metabolic disorders. Here's just a look at the emotional aspect. Anger, joy, shock, sadness, worry, pensiveness, fear. All of them affect the qi, leading to qi stagnation and qi deficiency, which makes people susceptible to this formation of phlegm. You're not able to metabolize the life experience. So what's phlegm? And it's an endogenous pathological factor, appears in the body when the body fluid is not transported by vital energy normally, and accumulates in certain parts of the body after being condensed. It can be visible, like phlegm, we can see it, but it's also invisible. It's inside the body, you don't see it. We can see it in the blood work, though. When you see high sugar levels, you see high lipid levels, you see lipoproteins, you see all kinds of things start to show up. That's how it manifests. Phlegm-related symptoms, expectorating, right? Tight chest, gastroctasia, anorexia, nausea, vomiting, dizziness, body mass changes, a thick tongue coating, sticky, slippery pulse. These are all things that are more associated with this phlegm picture, where you've gotten a little bit more pathologic than just dampness. You've gotten into phlegm dampness, where it's even more concentrated. There's a bunch of biomarkers now that help us understand phlegm dampness as a constitutional form. Now there are things like lipid panels, looking at the microbiota, which we talked about, and then looking at genes, certain upregulated genes that are associated with people that have phlegm dampness syndrome. And what we're going to find is that people with phlegm dampness have higher risk of metabolic disease. You could have somebody who's morbidly obese but doesn't have phlegm dampness versus someone who's morbidly obese and has phlegm dampness. Those two people have completely different mortality and morbidity outcomes. Because the changes that take place in the phlegm dampness constitution are pathological. Whereas the person who has a normal constitution but is obese, they're adapting. And they're adapting in a way that's still efficient enough that they're not in trouble. They don't have all these changes in their lipids, in their hypercoagulation, and inflammation, changes in hormones and growth factors. They're not showing it. And you can see now how the pattern recognition, the syndrome, Chinese medicine, overlays on the biomedical diagnosis. And it's beautiful. It's happening right now in the data today. Here's the research for you guys. And I will have all these available. The slides will be available, so you guys can have these and play with them and use them or whatever. Phlegm dampness constitution is one of the 9 constitutions, the most common type in constitutional study, because it's so associated with mortality, morbidity. You've got a higher risk of obesity, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, and diabetes than people with a balanced constitution, right? Gene functional analyses now predicting that people with phlegm dampness were susceptible to hyperlipidemia, and diabetes. So you can see now there's certain genes associated, certain lipids, certain microbiota. Very interesting stuff. So the microbes, right? You can see now that obese individuals with phlegm damp, which is different than just people who are obese and don't have phlegm damp, the ones that had phlegm damp syndrome, PDC, had higher body mass index, bigger waist circumference. Having, again, midsection obesity is more pathological than other places. Bigger hip circumference, altered composition of their gut microbiota compared to their non-PDC obese individuals. Again, so just having obesity is part of the risk, but if you have obesity with these pathological factors, now you see the risk showing up. And many people eventually might progress that way, but you've seen people who seem to be adapting very well, right? For some reason, they're 65, they're 75, and they're obese, and they're just, their blood work looks great. They don't really have a lot of problems. Genes, microbiota, right? They're all affecting what's happening in that person. They don't have the pathological backdrop. They might be headed there. We don't know, but it's certainly going to be. Oh, and I was going to say, one of the things you can see is that firmicute to Bacteroidetes ratio. And you can see these are classes of bacteria that you'll see on, if you do a stool analysis, you'll see them, firmicutes and Bacteroides. And you can see that there's this abundance of Bacteroides and decreased levels of firmicutes in people with phlegm damp. So I want to mention dampness heat. And I've talked a little bit about heat, right? When dampness and heat get together, it's just another level of problem, pathological issue. So obesity is defined as excess of body weight. You have unproportional amounts of energy storage, right, rather than energy burn. Increased fat progressively promotes the imbalance of energy storage. You get glucose, lipid, and protein metabolic disorders. And then you get into this thing where you have hypoxia, like I said before, with the fatty tissue not getting enough oxygen. And then you get inflammation with that lipotoxicity. These are key pathological characteristics of dampness heat syndrome in Chinese medicine. Dampness heat is prevalent in chronic low-grade systemic inflammation prone to insulin resistance, which is what? Just glucose and insulin not communicating, right? So then you're storing that glucose as fat rather than burning it for energy, causes variant metabolic disorders. What does it look like with damp heat? Well, chest distress, internal heat, fatigue, you got the heavy, soft limbs again. But then you've got dribbling, burning yellow urination, like scanty urination. There's that heat is cooking up the fluids. Dry stools, thick yellow color. Remember, heat always has the yellow color when it's the body fluid, yellow phlegm, yellow mucus, yellow tongue coat. It also has the redness, right? Redness coming out of the skin. You can see here like a boil, right? Some kind of like something that's festering under the skin. It wants to get out. It's got to get out of the body. That's the heat, the redness, the hotness. That's it wanting to get out of the body. Here's where you can see this little diagram. The bottom is insulin resistance and obese metabolic disorders. At the top is obesity, right, with the FADU, the lipotoxicity. And there's dampness heat syndrome leading to hypoxia on the left, systemic low-grade inflammation on the right. And moving down through the organs, you see what happens there. Common soil for chronic disease. What does that mean? Well, things that are really common that people die from. Cerebrovascular accidents, coronary heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, metabolic syndrome, polycystic ovarian syndrome, sleep apnea, mortality and morbidity associated chronic disease that has common soil, that has this damp heat, phlegm damp, dampness type of Chinese medicine picture. So looking at turbidity, stagnation, and phlegm dampness, you can see here I put this, like you can see the stagnant flow, right? It just doesn't look like that's not really the river I want to go swim in. The body can't effectively metabolize and detoxify turbid materials. This is what underlies most of the ubiquitous health issues we're facing today. Yes?
Would lipomas be a symptom of damp heat?
Lipomas are not heat, no. Lipomas are generally thought of as something undigested that the body was kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, so I'm going to stick it over here.
So they're systemic everywhere. So this is just
phlegmy, not heat. Could be phlegmy cold. They're more cold phlegmy. Absolutely. Yeah. Lipomas are kind of mysterious, but it's definitely, to me, it always gets back to like spiritual, emotional digestion. I'm not able to digest it. Like the liver can't metabolize it. So I'm just going to package it somewhere and stick it over somewhere else. Cysts and things like that. They have kind of a mysterious part to them. Overburdened, stagnant hepatobiliary tracts lead to a host of physiological dysfunctions. Lots of things go wrong. So here's metabolic syndrome. 44% of those in the greater than 50-year age group have metabolic syndrome in the U.S. Wow. What is it? Abdominal obesity, dyslipidemia, hypertension, sometimes type 2 diabetes, right? Increases the risk of coronary heart disease, right? And what's our number one cause of death? It's heart disease, right? That's the number one cause. So important stuff. Inactivity. Obesity is fundamental to metabolic syndrome. It's rising rapidly in both the developed and developing worlds. Inactivity and excess intake of food, of energy. If you're going to take in fuel, you got to burn it or store it. And we're taking in too much fuel to burn. The more you exercise and move, the more you burn. So the more fuel you can take in and burn it. So if you combine not moving and not burning it with taking in more, we have the problem that we're in. Mitochondrial dysfunction. Implicated in the major diseases of modern civilization: cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegeneration, and the aging process. That's what this whole conference is kind of about, right? Interesting bites on mitochondria, since we're talking about chi and energy and all that good stuff. A healthy person at rest produces their body weight in ATP every day. That's a lot of ATP. It's a lot of molecules. Pile them all up, it's a lot. At maximal exercise, ATP production can reach up to 1 to 2 pounds per minute. ATP production by mitochondria is a continuous process because you can't store it. It's active. Production is so important to cell function that mitochondria can make up as much as 25% of the volume of a cell. It's kind of funny because when you look at those diagrams, remember in science class, biology class, they go, oh, there's the ribosomes and there's the Golgi apparatus. Oh, there's a mitochondria. It's like, no, there should be between 1,000 and 2,500 mitochondria in each cell. That's a massive misrepresentation. Reduction in mitochondrial function has been found to associate with many of the chronic diseases. The brain uses 70% of our ATP, right? Neurodegeneration and ATP, and spleen Qi deficiency. Breakdown of the actual active Qi ATP process, the mitochondrial activity. So, equally as important, quenching free radicals. The mitochondria has to have a yin aspect as much as a yang aspect. We've got the furnace, we burn the fuel, we make the energy, but you got to have a place to contain it. You have to hold that fire, that heat. You need to make it insulated so that you can distribute it to the body through the cell. If you don't have a good insulator, if you don't quench the fire, it gets out of control and it burns everything up. That's the whole quenching system, redox cycling, the yin side of this equation. The energy shuttle, ATP, right? It's the energetic currency of the cell used to drive movement, mechanical work, moving our muscles, the heart, right? Metabolic reactions, transport substances across membranes. Electromagnetic energies. ATP synthase, right? Embedded in the mitochondrial membrane, provides a channel through which protons can cross the membrane down their concentration gradient. ATP synthesis is achieved by a rotary motor driven by a gradient of protons. Well, I think that's kind of like G. Saying. So ATP acts like the physical currency of Qi along with NADH and FADH, which drive the electron transport chain. This is oxidative phosphorylation, that very elegant biological process by which our cells make energy most of the time, right? 36 to 38 molecules of ATP per 2 molecules of glucose. It's a pretty cool thing. Whereas if you did like fermentation or just basic lactic acid cycle, you only get 2 net molecules of ATP for the same amount of sugar. So the charge across the membranes, that proton gradient, right, holding energetic magnetic energy between spaces to allow for gradients to happen. Part of that to me is a Qi related concept. And when Qi is deficient, there's not enough energetic substrate to make more material or more energy. So you sort of like get into that cycle again. You have to have some Qi to be able to break things down to make energy and make Qi again. So you have to have something to work with to start with. Herbs are great at giving us that material. So are nutrients. What are some of the primary nutrients for enhancing mitochondrial energy metabolism? CoQ10, L-carnitine, glutamine. I mentioned glutamine. Magnesium, I talked about that too. Magnesium bound to glutamine, creatine bound to magnesium, alpha lipoic acid, tyrosine, right? And acetyltyrosine for the brain more specifically, but tyrosine being the base moiety, the molecular structure for thyroid hormone, also for the adrenal medulla hormones, the catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, selenium, AGPC, and omega-3 fatty acids. Secondary nutrients. These are also supportive. NADH, people often give NAD plus now, right? It's a big part of the anti-aging community, trying to drive this process of replication of mitochondria and mitochondria biosynthesis and protection, all that. Zinc, B12, folate, and B6. These are all micronutrients or sort of vitamins or nutrients that we need little bits of to keep everything running. All the systems need these as cofactors. Vanadium and chromium, carotenoids, chlorophyll, and phenols from plants. So CoQ10 prevents the deterioration of mitochondrial energy production. CoQ10 is really important, right? It's the most important supplement for heart health. Statin drugs deplete CoQ10. You probably all know that by now, but what an interesting thing that the drug that we made to fix a problem causes another problem that's deeply associated with the same system, What business plan? Oh, yes. Spoken like a medical doctor who's been in the field for 60 years. Thank you. Russell Downs. Thank you. CoQ10 supplementation helps protect nerve cells, slows the progression of degenerative disease. CoQ10 levels were reduced in patients with neurological damage. We need this stuff. L-carnitine improves fatty acid utilization and energy production. Activated fatty acids are transported via the carnitine shuttle across the membranes of the mitochondria. So that's why we need carnitine as a shuttle to get fatty acids across those membranes through the gradients. And you get this coenzyme A, gets released the fatty acid, produces acetyl coenzyme A, which is the precursor to the drive in the Krebs cycle, and then that electron transport chain, which is how we make all that energy so efficiently with our Krebs cycle, our citric acid cycle. Neuroprotective effect from carnitine. And carnitine, of course, carne, right, from meat, right? Meats are rich in carnitine. So people who are vegetarian, you've got to kind of even think about that a little bit more. Creatine, another one that's really helpful. It's very anabolic. Better to have it combined with something other than monohydrate, because people take big doses of monohydrate, they'll, bodybuilders and such, because it's very important for regenerating ATP and building strength in the muscles by enhancing cellular ATP production. But with the monohydrate, if you take high amounts, it can be very renal toxic. It can be hard on the kidneys, damage them over time. So generally, I try to use the creatine bound to magnesium, creatine magnesium chelate. But a really good one for the aging population, for folks that are starting to break down. They need some anabolic support. Sorry, Russell had the first question. Go ahead.
Any reason to not just use acetyl L-carnitine instead of carnitine and not use carnitine itself so you get them through the blood-brain barrier effect as well?
I think you're probably right. I mean, most of the time, acetyl L-carnitine is the main form because it does cross the blood-brain barrier. I don't think it does any less, in other parts of the body, but it just gets through the blood-brain barrier. It might be a little bit more expensive. So for people that don't need it across the brain, it could be cheaper that way. But other than that, I don't think there's a big difference. Michael?
Just wondering if you have any recommended sources for creatine magnesium chelate.
Albion Labs. Yep. They make a really good one. Magnesium. Magnesium is it's just one of those things, almost everybody needs some of it. We use it in so many reactions. It's so important for detox, and we've depleted it in our soils, and then we deplete our bodies of it trying to detox everything and using up all of our stores of cofactor. So we need it. And we need it for, our muscle strength, for spasms and cramps. We need it to prevent mitochondrial damage. So we need it all over the place. So you almost always want to give somebody magnesium. Just remember that it's bowel tolerance, right? It's an osmotic. So it will pull fluid into the bowel at some level. It will cause diarrhea. That's the only way you've got too much of it for a person, is just it'll cause diarrhea. It's also great for inducing bowel movements for people that have, difficulty, but don't stop addressing their fundamental problem. If they have, dry stools because they have damp heat, don't just give them magnesium. Get rid of the damn heat. Use that Coptis. Here's creatine magnesium chelate, just showing, how specific it is, enhancing mitochondria, neuroprotective, 3 to 5 grams a day, right? increased brain energy capacity, improves cognitive performance, neuroprotective, lowers glutamate, and tons of data. So here's the challenge. So we have obesity and insulin resistance, right? Most significant challenge to our society to date, involving poor quality, increased quality of food, lack of physical activity, absence of stress management. And you can just sum that. That's kind of like just the basis of disease right now for us. This is it. So simple. Alarming growth of obesity around the planet, and of course, metabolic syndrome. 4 contributing causes: insulin resistance, diet, what you eat and don't eat, sedentary, environmental stress, and then genes. If you get into the genetics, the SNPs, you can dig around in there. You'll find all these SNPs that are associated with more detrimental effects from, metabolic syndrome, more likely to have metabolic syndrome with obesity. There's insulin resistance in the middle there. You see the symptoms is the tree, roots down below, all these nutrient deficiencies, what I was just talking about. Like I said, our soils are depleted, our foods are depleted, our bodies are depleted from trying to use them as cofactors. So you've got to kind of supply them. You've also got the diet, lifestyle, the gut dysbiosis in the middle there. So antibiotics, right? Talked about this at length with the microbe stuff, in the past. And prenatal period antibiotic exposure programs the host to an obesity-prone metabolic phenotype. Did anybody's mother have to take antibiotics, you think, while you were in the womb? Maybe. Pretty common. That's just one of many, many ways that we're disrupting the microbiota, disrupting the soil so that we are, predisposed to have these problems. Underlying imbalances: insulin and glucose signaling abnormalities, adipocyte hormone disruptions, leptin, ghrelin resistant, and aromatase. Those are all made by fat cells, and they affect different aspects of the glucose-insulin relationship, and hunger and satiety. Another one in there that I didn't put is called adiponectin, and we'll look that one again. Lipid metabolism alterations, more estrogen circulating. Remember, estrogen is associated with storage, so we get thyroid, estrogen, you get leptin, insulin, and glucose signaling, adrenal. All this stuff starts to play together where you start to see this picture unfolding in people. Reduced thyroid function, deficiency of androgens, increase of estrogens, hypertension, more coagulation. And remember, estrogen is associated with coagulation. So you give people estrogen and then you have coagulation problems. Yeah.
So could you speak just a little bit the microbiota? If adding in probiotics is not really the best way to help people balance and create their own microbiome.
Yeah, Michael's questions about probiotics and how to support people's digestion and their microbiota population, and whether probiotics are or aren't the best way to do that. And I think in summary, I think when people have big imbalances in their microbiota, you can get the best results when you do both. When you kind of use the probiotics like targeted competitors. Like if you know that a person has yeasts that are really, active, like they're, overgrowing, you can put Saccharomyces boulardii in their protocol along with all your other things like your candibactin, your oregano oil, your caprylic acid, your lauric acid, everything else that you're going to use to get rid of the yeast, and you're going to do all the dietary stuff. You add the yeast that's synergistic with us and competes with those yeasts, you get really good results. But they don't need to be on Saccharomyces boulardii forever. Once you've changed their soil, their ecosystem, then they'll establish control, and you can take that away. Like I don't like people to be on probiotics every day. Like I always cycle them on and off because I want people to continue to manifest their own microbiota population, not need that input, just like with the pancreatic enzymes. Sure, if someone doesn't have a pancreas, well, they got to have pancreatic enzyme. If you don't have a thyroid, you need thyroid hormone. But if you have the gland, let's work with it and try to get it working well. That's my thought. So here's some really great blood tests for you guys to know about and to have lists of these. Is it really 11:15? Okay, well, check that out. This is all really cool stuff. Glucose and insulin, organ function, CBC, comprehensive metabolic panel, coagulation, nutrient status, inflammation. We've got cardiovascular assessment, right? The Berkeley Heart Labs test and the Cleveland Heart Labs test. I like all those underneath the Cleveland Heart Labs, the apolipoproteins, big B, big A, little a, APO E4, APO E1, 2, 3, TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, ADMA, this is asymmetric and symmetric dimethyl arginine associated with nitric oxide formation, microalbumin, the plaque test, LPA LPPLA2, which is a really good one that looks at the risk of throwing a thrombotic piece of material from your intima of your blood vessels. Heart rate variability, and the VAP test, where you take cholesterol and you break it into the particle size, right? Look at LDL particles rather than just LDL. Or did I miss that? Oh, yeah. Physical stuff, right? Blood pressure, composition, heart rate, respiratory rate. We got to put all these things together, of course. And then hormones, estrogens, testosterone, your androgens, dihydrotestosterone, sex hormone binding globulin, get your thyroid hormones. You want to make sure you look at all of those together. A thyroid stimulating hormone, right, from the pituitary, free and total T3 and T4, reverse T3, thyroglobulin, and then the thyroid peroxidase antibodies to see what's going on there. You want to look for Hashimoto's and Graves' disease. For some people, they have autoimmunity, but then also just looking for how that thyroid picture, as the director of metabolic activity, will fluctuate with that insulin and glucose disruption. Morning cortisol. This is just insulin resistance, looking at the tolerance. Insulin and glucose don't communicate well together. This is more just look again, genes, chronic exposures, insulin resistance. You have the overactivation of the stress response system, imbalance of sex hormones. There's all this stuff tied together. And here's the biomarkers. Looking at glucose and insulin, you got glucose, insulin, those are fasting. Hemoglobin A1C, that's the record of your damage to your hemoglobin and your red blood cells. C-peptide, how much insulin's coming out of the pancreas, because insulin will stack. So when you measure it, it's not accurate. So if you want to get accurate level of production of insulin, you want to look at C-peptide, which is a peptide that's cleaved each time an insulin molecule is made in a beta islet cell. So C-peptide often levels will still be viable in a person that's diabetic. And if that's true, then they're still making insulin. You can get them to make more. So C-peptide's really cool. But look at all this stuff. You can see what's going on here. There's a lot of material here to look into and get familiar with. Liver enzymes get affected by the insulin resistance, can't degrade insulin. Estrogen abnormalities, testosterone. And then I mentioned the adipocytes, right? Those fat cells making adiponectin, which actually increases sensitivity. That will go down and leptin will go up. And you can run leptin levels. More than anything, it's for people to see that number. Like if you're working with someone to change this metabolic syndrome pattern, measure their leptin and show them over time that it's getting better. It's a really cool way to just kind of, hey, my leptin was 30. Oh, now it's 12. That's really cool. I'm doing the right thing. Things are improving. Because sometimes with people that have obesity and metabolic syndrome, it can take months of hard work before you see any change in the actual physical body. Things are happening internally to change what's happening, but you don't see it. And so it's hard. But then you can look at some of the markers and say, hey, but look, things are happening inside. It's changing. Then people get inspired and go, oh, okay, it is happening. Because it gets really frustrating. You're like 6 months in, you've been working so hard and nothing's happening. No, I'll show you. Things are happening. Stick with it. Increased leptin, decreased adiponectin, increased pro-inflammatory cytokines, increased angiogenesis. There's a hypoxia, HIF1, hypoxia-inducible factor 1. Increased insulin leads to cell proliferation. Hyperinsulinemia leads to a decrease in the AMPK, right? Adenosine monophosphate kinase. That's the big protector. It increases mTOR, which is a big driver of growth. Decreases the binding proteins that bind up the insulin-like growth factors. And increases free insulin-like growth factor, which is a big growth signal. Grow, which is not what we want, especially with aging and protection. We want to turn that stuff down and put our cells in resting phase. Increases P53. That's a genetic mutation that leads to more mutations. Increase estrogen through the aromatase enzyme, which converts testosterone into estrogen. Decrease sex hormone binding globulin. Increase free sex hormones. And then thyroid dysfunction. Of course, endocrine disruptors are a big part of that. Thyroid, I mentioned this before, insulin, leptin, estrogens, mitochondria, hepatic detox. You've got all these issues, hyperthyroidism associated with cancers and some, especially risks of getting them. So all these things tied together. Look at all these things. You'll see the patterns. Lipoic acid, one of my favorite nutrients all the way around, recycles other antioxidants, or what we call redox cycling agents. Stimulates glucose transport, inhibits glycosylation, which is one of the main processes of aging. We glycosylate. So sugars basically rust the metal in our body. Our hemoglobin breaks down and rusts. Things start to oxidize, right? You can block this with alpha lipoic acid. I like a form that's actually sustained release, 600 milligrams for people that have really severe stuff. You can do 300 milligrams, couple, 2 or 3 times a day with most folks. Take it between meals. It'll help to stabilize insulin and glucose. Sodium R alpha lipoic acid. And make sure you're using RALA. Great for the eyes. People are having all these eye breakdown. The liver, when the liver can't detoxify, the liver opens into the eyes. And so all the little fine machinery in the eyes, the blood vessels and everything start to suffer. Retinal detachment, macular degeneration, cataracts, plateau iris, you name it. All these things that start to happen in the eyes, it's a product of the liver not being able to help the cells detoxify those free radicals that damage the tissues. Here's a bunch of references on ALA. I mentioned AMPK. Just want to make sure that you understand AMPK basically is a protective mechanism that puts your cells in rest. Instead of creating more and more and more, they go into resting phase. This is AMP again. Nutrients like berberine I mentioned, right, which increases insulin sensitivity. Berberine before meals is a great way for people that have the blood sugar handling issues. It's great in cancer. People that you want to regulate you want to downregulate mTOR, which is a driver of growth, and upregulate AMPK to put cells in the resting phase. That's a good thing. Then we go through autophagy. Our body will start to go through the junk that it has and get rid of it and reuse it. But it won't do that if you constantly are in the growth phase. So berberine helps take us out of that. There's ALA, curcumin, flavonoids. Here's a bunch of really cool botanical medicines, compounds and nutrients and drugs that all are really helpful for the insulin glucose problems. I'm going to go into these in detail. Back to ginseng, one of the great ones for diabetes and for this whole picture of having blood sugar and glucose problems. Inhibition of lipogenesis increases the liver's manufacture of glucose. Solutions, adaptogens, insulin-trophic plants, and alteratives. Alteratives enhance the capacity of the liver and the spleen, the lymph system to remove toxins. List of botanicals with insulin-tropic, anti-inflammatory, and anti-cancer effects. Pterocarpus marsupium, really good one. Helps with the beta islet cells. Green tea, love that, just always. Holy basil, Polygonum cuspidatum, richest source of resveratrol, chaparral, NDGA, nordihydroguaretic acid, that's really good. And for so many things, cancer, especially when people have cancer, they have the insulin issue. This is really great stuff to use. Curcumin, which just targets so many different areas. Cinnamon and golden seal, or huangmian, that's the coptis again. These ones are real specific. Bitter melon, really good. Momordica. Black cumin, Nigella sativa, fenugreek coleus, goat's rue, right, which is the source of metformin, right, one of the biguanides. Mucuna perians, Salacia reticulata, gymnema, jambul, and cinnamon. Cinnamon is a really good one. You throw it in a smoothie. It's really good for just helping the blood sugar. Momordica being one of the top herbs with the charantin, Salacia, the saponins, and then gymnemic acids. Berberine sulfate, which is extracted from coptis or, synthesized now, but it can also come from barberry. But berberine itself, really helpful in a formula. Cinnamon and black cumin. So bitter melon increases glucose utilization by the liver, decreased gluconeogenesis, the building of new glucose, right? And improves glucose oxidation, enhances uptake of glucose, and increase the number of insulin-producing beta cells. So what a cool material, right? How awesome that we have these plants that do these things. Also has all these other effects: anti-tumor, anti-diabetic, antioxidant. Here's goat's rue, right? Metformin, the biguanide, developed from galagine. Anti-melanoma. Novel weight-reducing action. Again, sensitizing glucose and insulin. Salacia reticulata. This is an Ayurvedic medicine that improves insulin resistance and glucose metabolism and reduces obesity. Nigella sativa, black cumin. This is such a great, it's so good. Thymoquinone, this you see at the bottom, 8%, you can get a supercritical fluid extract. Thymoquinone has so many health benefits now for cancer, for diabetes, and for all this metabolic syndrome. It's really amazing. And look at all the different things because they're all tied together. Inflammation, hypoglycemia, hypertension, asthma, microbes, all of it. And green tea reduces body fat, stimulates brown adipose tissue thermogenesis. So it starts to just help your body burn faster. So if you want to drink something in the morning that's really healthy for your patients, it's green tea. Green tea is amazing. Drink it throughout the day. You see, there's so much data on green tea and its protective effects in cancer, thermogenesis, increasing lifespan, improving stress resistance. And the caffeine part's really important. Some people are really sensitive to caffeine, right? You have to be careful. But generally, the caffeine part and the methylated xanthines, the theobromine, theophylline, and caffeine are all really helpful and beneficial, and they work together with the whole spectrum, the catechins and the polyphenols. I mentioned Pterocarpus marsupium, pterostilbene. One of the only things that actually has been shown in some studies to reverse damaged beta islet cells, repopulate those beta islet cells, the cells that make insulin. Because when people are type 1 diabetic, what happens, or if they're getting on the edge of it, their body has identified their beta islet cells as non-self. And so they have autoimmune, they've actually built antibodies to their beta islet cells. So they're destroying them. So when they're gone, they're gone. You won't have any C-peptide. You don't make any insulin. But with Pterocarpus, if there are some remaining, you use this plant and help to regenerate them. It's really powerful. Anti-diabetic effects comparable to metformin in this data. More on Pterocarpus. So many references. Blueberries are the one berry, just one food that people are always like, can I eat something? I just want to eat something that's like, good. I'm like, yeah, you can eat some blueberries. They're really good. They're really cool. Look what they do. Lower the risk of developing diabetes. Rich in polyphenols. Improvements in insulin resistance. But some people will go, oh man, I love that you gave me, I could eat blueberries. So I'm like eating like a bowl of blueberries like twice a day. And I'm like, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, like have some blueberries as a snack, a little bit, just a few of them. Like you're in the forest foraging, you got a few berries. Good. Not like, buckets of them. Chronic stress, right? Sleep deprivation, oxidative, stress, inflammation, cancer. The night shifts, man. People who work the night shifts, it's so hard on the body. It's so hard on the stress response system. The swing shift, like where you're like, okay, I'm going to go and work for 3 nights, then I'll come home and flip my schedule and be with my family. It's like, no, that's like a recipe for disaster. Nurses often have this issue because they get stuck in that switching schedules. If you want to do it, you can just go to the night side. Just live at night. That's fine. You can just stay there. Don't flip and go back and forth and back and forth. Fatty acids oxidized by most tissues of the body. Adrenal medulla, glucose, the stress response. The energy yield from a gram of fatty acids is more than twice as much from a gram of carbs. Bears hibernate for 7 months using beta oxidation of fats to produce their energy. So carnitine and acetyl L-carnitine, kind of went over this before, but they can really help to increase your use of fatty acids. What are the key therapeutic targets in cardiovascular disease? Well, all this stuff you hear, hypertension, free radicals, inflammation, blood stagnation. We're going to hit that in just a minute. Improve anabolic metabolism, modulate the stress response, calm the central nervous system. Don't forget to calm the central nervous system. And if I didn't mention it before, calm the central nervous system. Yeah. It's super important. So this is red yeast rice dealing with cholesterol, right? Guess what? It was an herb from Chinese medicine antiquity. It grew on the rice, right? This red rice, this yeast that grows on there. And what does it do? Oh, it resolves spleen dampness and phlegm. How interesting. You know what we found out it does? It gets rid of cholesterol. It lowers cholesterol levels, especially like bad cholesterols, ones that are disruptive. Oh, really? How does that work? Well, it has these things in it called monocolins. These little monocolins and all these other molecules inside this material that works really well to get rid of that phlegmy, sticky material that's invisible. But you can see it in the blood, right? With apolipoproteins and all things we talked about, right? Follow me? Well, they extracted the monocolins from this stuff. Yeah? Monocolin K. It was the first statin drug called lovastatin. Now you can't even have higher than like 0.4% monocolin content in your red yeast rice because it's a drug. Yeah. This stuff is great though. And if you take high doses of it, some people will be sensitive enough to it that they do need a little bit of CoQ10. The main CoQ10 deficiency thing with statins is, like really severe muscle pains. Like, oh God, my shoulder just started hurting. Oh, you started a statin a month ago? Oh, we should probably stop that. And the pain goes away. Sometimes it can get really bad. I mean, I even seen like some pretty deep changes happen. But when you disrupt that level of CoQ10 energy mitochondrial manufacture, you can have big problems like, myopathies, cardiomyopathies. So this is a really good thing. I love Hong Chu, red yeast rice. 500 milligrams of a good extract is a great place to go. Yeah, but combine it with other things.
Yeah, confirming with the muscle pain. I had someone wake up with a sprained ankle after.
Yeah. High dose statin, waking with a sprained ankle. Yeah. I've seen some really weird things where I'm just like, okay, guys, we're playing with fire here. Hawthorn for the heart, inotropic, balancing. And the data on hawthorn is amazing. There's so much free radical quenching. It just protects the blood vessels like nobody's business. It's really beautiful stuff. It was used in Chinese medicine for damp spleen, the fruit of hawthorn. Although now, with the modern medicine, modern herbal medicine, we use more of the whole aerial parts, right? But you can put it all together and you get this great effect. See all the beautiful things. Atherosclerosis inhibits LDL, hyperlipidemia, stabilizes collagen, improves heart irrigation. So big doses. You can do teaspoon doses of this stuff. And people with arrhythmias and things like that, combine things together. Yeah, Russell.
Is it worthwhile taking Arjuna with the hawthorn to improve its function?
What do you think? Are you reading my mind here? You really studied these things, didn't you? Yes, I would say you could definitely take Arjuna with hawthorn. I love putting those two together. Arginolic acid, another Ayurvedic plant, right? Cardiotonic, diuretic, hypotensive, right? So these are just, again, general stuff when you have cardiovascular issues, when you have lipid issues with the phlegm dampness syndrome. This is the way you can go. And again, look at all this protection, cardiomyopathy, decreases total and LDL cholesterol compared to placebo, stable angina, it helps with angina, pain in the heart. Here's resveratrol. It clears away all these things, blood stagnation, heat, dampness, phlegm, toxins. And it has this, it's a stilbene, just like pterocarpus has that pterostilbene in it. They're very similar, and they're used by the plants to resist fungal infection. In our bodies, they help with blood sugar signaling, glucose and insulin signaling. So many benefits. It's amazing. And then the Chinese medicine side of it, you can see just getting rid of all these toxins. So here's just a little list. Here's how people, you just want to start with something. Someone comes in, hey, can you help me with this? Just start right here. Here it is. It's a roadmap. You can always, bifurcate to your own little turns and things, but, go into the cul-de-sac where you want to hang out. But this is the roadmap. So as we transition to part 3, we're going to look at hypoxia, because I mentioned it's an important feature of dampness. Dampness that's sticky now. It's not so full of oxygen. Increases hypoxia-inducible factors, which then drive angiogenesis, the growth of new blood vessels, which in this world of cancer and things like that, we don't want that. Increase in inflammation, decrease in adiponectin, right? Adiponectin is the thing that makes our glucose and insulin signaling better. Imbalanced intestinal flora, increased lipopolysaccharides, altogether causing chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, and obese metabolic disease. Here's just a diagram of that. Non-diabetic on the left, diabetic on the right. Hypoxia. I'd give you guys a break, but we won't make it. Anybody want a question or anything? Part 3? Okay. Part 2 is okay? Okay. Anybody having fun? All right, good. You guys are waking up, I think. Okay. I love hearing people's clinical correlations and things like you said, just because we all have these experiences where you're sitting there with somebody like, God, really? That's what happened? Woke up with a sprained ankle. Like, man, how'd you do that? I mean, people come in all the time like, oh, my back hurts. Oh, yeah, what happened? Oh, I slept wrong. Like, dude, you're 48 years old. You can't figure out how to sleep yet? Like, come on, there might be something else going on here. It's like, why didn't you sleep right? There's something happening in the body. So when you disrupt systems, you have changes that manifest in all different times of our life. All right, part 3, blood stagnation, coagulation, and thrombosis. All right, the correlation, coagulation and blood stagnation. The TCM concept of blood stagnation correlates with coagulation and hypercoagulation. Hypercoagulation is just coagulation that's happening not normally. It's more coagulation than you need. And coagulation is just that protection from you from bleeding, right? We don't want you to bleed. We want to have the blood be sticky enough that it stays together. Stagnant blood has to be removed to heal, right? So that new material can be brought into damaged areas. I mentioned how a bruise is a great example of stagnant blood. Okay? But inside the body, without a bruise, a cancer is also a blood stagnation type of coagulopathy, which we'll talk about. Hemostasis is the normal process that we prevent losing blood through our vessels. Very well balanced. It's intrinsic. It's got the platelets, the blood vessels, and the whole coagulation system regulating it. And so there's a whole process that goes on that we form a clot to stop bleeding, right? And then we remove the clot afterwards. And we just go through that. Everything in our body is a building up and breaking down, right? Bone is resorbing and then depositing, right? Calcium is going on the bone and being resorbed. Everything is building up and breaking down, always. And so, same thing with clotting. This will be a quiz on this in 20 minutes. What I wanted to point out about this is that you have, in the middle is thrombin. You see thrombin? prothrombin, and then thrombin, of course, for thrombus, right? It's generating a thrombus. So thrombin is going to push fibrinogen as a precursor to become fibrin, literally fibrous material that sticks to platelets to become a clot. Okay. On the other side of that is plasmin, and the precursor to that is plasminogen. And plasmin digests the fibrin into plasma. It's like it replasmifies the fibrin, whereas thrombin thrombifies the blood. So those are the two sides, and a lot of what we do will work with those. The other factors and things, it's more complex, but people can have, factor 11 deficiencies. They can have factor 10 problems. People can have factor 5 laden. Lots of things that can alter this and make it, dysregulated. So it's good to know those things about people. And if people are having problems like, oh, I've had like these random pulmonary embolisms. Well, have you been tested for von Willebrand's? Have you been tested for factor 5 laden? Have you looked at the factor 10? And, these are things that you can always help people look a little deeper if they're kind of having chronic issues. But we'll be working mostly around that fibrin clot area. So although viewed separately, coagulation and inflammation are highly integrated. Crosstalk between them, where one system gets activated, the other one gets amplified. Inflammation drives coagulation, coagulation drives inflammation. Okay? Tissue factor is positioned at the nexus of coagulation and inflammation. Right? Again, this tissue factor receptor in the middle of it all is the key. And we're not going to go too deep into it, but just so you understand, this is sort of like the point that connects inflammation and coagulation together is this tissue factor. And if you look back here, you'll see tissue factor up at the top there. It's a big part of this process and what kind of starts everything moving. Vascular endothelial growth factor and interleukin 8. These are big angiogenesis factors that are also very tied to tissue factor. And so inflammation and coagulation, and then blood stagnation. And remember, stagnation, the buildup of stuff, and then the heat, and then inflammation and coagulation. This is how I'm making the weave. So here's blood stagnation in the center. These are the treatments on blue, right on the left, right? Botanicals, enzymes, fatty acids, nutrients. And then you see the markers on the right. The platelets, fibrinogen, D-dimer. We'll talk about that one. Tissue factor, plasminogen activator, inhibitor 1. Plasminogen, remember, that's the one that digests the fibrin. So plasminogen activator inhibitor doesn't allow plasmin to get formed, and so keeps the clots around. So people will have a disruption in that area. Homocysteine, it's an inflammatory cardiovascular marker. Asymmetric dimethylarginine. And then you have some other things on the left there, galectin-3, TGF-beta. Those are associated with fibrosis in the cardiovascular system. You can run these are blood tests. These are all blood tests you can get run. You can run them through direct labs to patients. You can have doctors. You can say, hey, ask your doctor to run this. If you're a doctor, you can run it yourself. Those are matrix metalloproteases. They're associated with angiogenesis also. Second leading cause of death in cancer patients is venous thromboembolism. People are at high risk because cancers are coagulopathy. It's already manipulating the environment. And when the environment is already disrupted, it makes it more likely that cancer shows up. This is a list for you to have. Don't memorize it. Just keep it. Bigger list. This is how I like to, if I'm evaluating someone for cardiovascular disease and they have a lot of risks, I'd love to get all these tests. How cool. It's like you go to the car, you go to the mechanic and then you plug the car in and then they run the diagnostics. Oh, here's the codes. There are 3 codes. Oh, cool. Let's fix those. That's kind of like what I've designed here. Fibrinogen originates in the liver, converted to fibrin. Elevated levels are associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, and stroke. Clot formation, elevated in cancer. Most heart attacks are known to be due to acute thrombosis, sudden formation of a blood clot at the site of an atherosclerotic plaque. Remember, atherosclerotic plaques aren't just like building up and building up and building up until the blood vessel is closed off. There is some narrowing of vessels that occurs, but most of what's happening when people die of a heart attack or they have a stroke is because the actual layers of the atherosclerotic plaque and what's underneath it, the foam cells and all the things that are built up through inflammatory changes, the intima breaks open and then the clot is released as a thrombus that goes down that blood vessel and goes all the way down until it gets to a small enough blood vessel that it's blocking the flow behind that. And then that's a hypoxic event, right? That's either your pulmonary embolism, your heart attack, your blood, your something in the brain. So increased risk of heart attacks with fibrinogen level. So fibrinogen level, I like it under 375. Most labs go a little lower than that, but I think that's a good place to be. So every 1 gram per liter associated with more than 2 times increased risk of fatal and non-fatal CVD, stroke, and deaths. there's so much data. Like when I ask somebody, I was like, hey, because even if I can run the labs in the state I'm practicing in, it doesn't matter. Like if I'm not a medical doctor, oftentimes I don't get good insurance coverage. So I'll ask someone's doctor and say, hey, would you run this test? I go, well, I don't know what that test does. I don't know what it means. I don't think that has anything to do with anything. I'm like, well, here's 20 studies showing you the prognostic value of this test in cancer. And then we can also address it. We have therapies. We have tools that have tons of data showing how I can work with fibrinogen and reduce the level. I'll show you right now. We'll do it. You run this level now. It's elevated. I'll treat the patient. 8 weeks, run it again. I'll show you it's lower. And people oftentimes, doctors will say, sure, let's do it. But it takes a little bit of diplomacy, Elevated levels associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, all the same stuff, right? Enhances IL-1 beta, that's the inflammasome, and also NF-kappa beta, big drivers of cancer-related inflammation. I mentioned D-dimer. This is a really cool one. They run this in the emergency room oftentimes to assess whether there's some kind of a clot that's happened in the body. And when D-dimer levels are high, it's a big indication that the body is making lots of clots. Because what it is once that fibrinogen becomes fibrin, it binds to platelets, and the platelets and the fibrin become together as a clot, the body has to break that down. And it breaks that down by cleaving it into peptide parts, peptides that are called D-dimer. So when you see the D-dimer level go up, it means that the body is making and breaking down more clots than normal. And so normally the range would be like less than 0.4 or less than 400, depending on the units they're using. So you'll see like with cancer patients, it can easily go up to like 4, 6, 8 times the range because there's so much coagulation happening with the cancer that it's driving that system way high. That means that's why they're all at risk, right? Like I said, 7 to 10 times as high risk for a stroke or a clotting disease or a clotting event than a normal person with just with having cancer. Yeah.
Would something like lumbrokinase?
Yes, absolutely. Lumbrokinase is the number one enzyme for affecting plasmin and digesting fibrin for cancer-related coagulation. Yeah, we'll get to that one too. Plasminogen activators, they're the things that activate plasminogen to become plasmin to break down the clot, right? And so when the one test we often run is called plasminogen activator inhibitor 1, it inhibits the activation of plasminogen, meaning that the clot doesn't get broken down. So the clots stay around longer. Cancer likes that. It's involved in progression and invasion of cancer. Correlates with increased body mass, high plasma insulin levels. Insulin's dangerous. We don't want high insulin any more than we want high glucose. That's why even like insulin potentiated chemotherapy, it's like, man, you're giving people a lot of insulin. Like insulin's not good to have in high levels. It's really disruptive to the body. Skin tags, watch for it. High insulin levels. You'll see it. People are like, oh, I got skin tags. What is that? You see that's their insulin levels being high. I mean, that's just one part of the whole picture, but you know how complex it is. High levels of triglycerides, low density lipoprotein, very low density lipoprotein, oxidized LDL. They all stimulate the production of PAI1. Invisible phlegm. That's what we're talking about. This is Phlegm-Darm syndrome. That's why people are at risk of these problems. They have these underlying issues that run into coagulation. And now you're at risk of having a stroke. You're at risk of having cardiovascular disease. The bottom of this is really important here. Leukocyte and platelet counts, white blood cell counts and platelets. Platelet counts go up high too in a lot of cancers too, and they'll be associated with more coagulation. I mentioned galectin-3. It's really good to measure in cancer. It has to do with fibrin formation and also metastatic spread of cancer. But it's also very useful in cardiovascular disease. Galectin-3 levels, as they go up, people have higher risk of cardiovascular events. Fibrinogen D-dimer, transforming growth factor beta-1. That's also a really important one for the formation of fibrin and clotting in the blood for fibrosis. When people have like radiation and they have damage, TGF-beta levels will be higher because they'll be in this repair where the radiation-induced fibrosis is increasing. Also, TGF-beta-1, we'll look at it, but it's an important one to run before somebody does a radical intervention like a surgery or a radiation, because if it's already high and someone does that intervention, they're at much more high likelihood of having a metastatic event happen because that's a driver. TGF-beta-1, released from platelets, contributes to hypercoagulability and cancer metastasis, right? Increases that PAI1 and tissue factor. And the platelets actually function as mediators of tumor-bone communication. So the platelets actually start signaling so remember, the tumor itself is its own thing, but it's controlling the immune system. It's got a hold of your body. Why? Because it is your body. It has all the tools that your body has. It uses all the same growth factors and all the same pathways. and it says, hey, neutrophils, come over here. We're building a tower. Help us. The neutrophils are like, okay, cool. Oh, you guys, oh, great. Yeah, sure. No problem. And they're like, platelets, we're going to go over there. Oh, you go signal to that tissue over there that we're sending some colonists over there and get it ready over there, right? Break up the soil and stuff. Get it ready. They're like, oh, okay, sure. They go and do that. Tumor-associated neutrophils, tumor-associated macrophages, tumor-associated fibroblasts. The half of the weight of a solid tumor can be immune cells. It's kind of shocking, but it's real. So platelets. Transforming growth factor beta is a really important marker, and you can get this test run. Galectin-3, easy to get also. Linked to poor outcomes in cardiovascular disease. Right? Proliferation, apoptosis, inflammation, fibrosis. Elevated levels, particularly a big role in promoting inflammation and fibrosis. Serum tumor marker. Target range less than 18. And one of the best treatments, modified citrospectin, MCP. Great for galectin-3. It can lower galectin-3 levels and protect people from cardiovascular disease and also from cancer progression. Just a few references. So how do we work with TGF-beta1? Curcumin, green tea, grape seed extract. They all have been shown to inhibit TGF-beta1. And you see there, green tea extract, the big part is the catechins, e.g. CG, epigallocatechin gallate. That's the important one. So you get like a 40% extract. You still, like I said, you still want to have the methylated xanthines and the polyphenols in there, but using a little EGCG extract, a little more potent, will be better for hitting TGF-beta1. So when you see this level elevated, you want to make sure you're targeting with these plants. There's reishi, organoderma, astragalus, salvia miltiorhiza. We're going to hit that one hard. I love that plant. That's it right there. That's this beautiful purple heart plant. Withania somnifera, that's ashwagandha, suppresses TGF-beta. Resveratrol, that's NDGA, which we saw from chaparral. Salvionolic acid from the Don Shen, Salvia miltiorhiza. And there's Asiatic acid from Centella asiatica, which is Centella, right? Centella asiatica. And then we have forskolin, which is from Coleus forskolai, right? Coleus, the Coleus plant. These all have inhibitory effects on TGF-beta1. Probably more plants do. A lot of them do. If they're blood stagnation relieving or qi and blood promoting, they're probably going to have an effect on this area. But, there's only so much data that we have. And remember, this is all from, originally like from in vitro studies and then animals. Most of these things, most of the studies that we have, because we don't have the money to study the plants because they're not patentable. You can't make back the $1 billion it takes to study them in the way that, Anyway, so here's platelets, right? Special implications for metastasis. They contribute to the hypercoagulable state. They provide a coagulant surface, facilitating amplification of cancer-related coagulation. They can be recruited to cloak cancer cells, shielding them from the immune response, facilitating cancer growth and dissemination. They play a role in vascularity and angiogenesis. So check out those platelet levels. Watch them carefully. Prothrombotic, you see there, increased leptin, decreased adiponectin. You see adipose tissue plus the high glucose. What you see here is that increase in aromatase, right, which is what takes the androgen, testosterone, and turns it into estrogens. And the estrogens then lead to coagulation. And of course, with that, the induction of hypoxia-inducible factors, and then that angiogenesis is increased in cancer. Stress again. Stress just, again, the beta-adrenergic stress system, BAR, beta-adrenergic receptor network, has been associated with progression of cancer, poor outcomes. 2 big studies on breast cancer and ovarian cancer showed that people who took beta blockers did much better. So you block that system with a drug, you can do better. But we don't need to do that. We've got great lifestyle, therapies and plenty of herbs that can help calm the central nervous system, turn that down so people will have less risk of problems with recurrence, metastases, etc. So botanicals to inhibit platelet aggregation, things like yarrow and Panax ginseng are really big ones. Panax ginseng, nodo ginseng has all this amazing kind of yin and yang effects where it actually increases the ability of the body to clot, but it also decreases the risk of having a detrimental clot. So it does both. And then they were like, well, how can that happen? And then the researchers dissected the plant, and it has this whole different spectrum of ginsenosides, half of which do one thing and half of which do the other. So the plant, does it have some intelligence? Yes, it does. As a whole organism, as a living creation, that plant does something to our blood to help protect us. And what it does in Chinese medicine is it removes blood stagnation to stop bleeding. The idea is that if the stagnant blood is blocking the flow of blood through the vessels, then the blood extravasates and moves out of the vessels into the tissues. So if you open the stagnation, the blood flows, the blood stays in the channels. Enzymes, herbs, nutrients, lumbrokinase, like you mentioned, bromelain and nattokinase, some of the big ones in the enzymes. Herbs, adaptogens, tonics, or the stress response, right? Blood and liver moving, stimulating the periphery, stimulants and relaxants, nutrients like fatty acids, magnesium again, the vitamin E spectrum, and arginine and citrulline. Arginine and citrulline specifically for that ADMA, SDMA, that's the asymmetric dimethyl arginine, which relates to nitric oxide production and the vasodilation system, because when you can't dilate your blood vessels, you're much more likely to have a problem because things are pinched down. We want things to open up. So enzymes for inhibiting thrombosis, you've got the earthworm, lumbrokinase, right, from the lumbricals. You've got your natto from natto miso, soy. You've got your bromelain from pineapple, from the stems. And then you've got other enzymes like serrapeptase, which I use a lot, which is more as a mucolytic agent for fluid drainage, especially if, phlegm buildup in the lungs, like lots of sticky fluid and things like that. Serrapeptase is really good. Green papaya, biogestin, which is really good for digestion, especially of proteins. I love the green papaya extract. Pancreatic enzymes and pancreatic cancer. You can use those specifically when people, don't have pancreatic function. And then lipase you can use to improve the digestion of fats. Here's lumbrokinase, originally from the earthworm, right? The earthworms go through the earth and they're chewing through stuff like digesting cellulose and all kinds of things. The lumbrokinase they make and use to digest fibrin in the earth as they're moving through and clearing out the earth to make these pathways that then make everything flow inside the earth. And it degrades fibrin. It also activates plasminogen and acts as a thrombolytic medicine. So it actually helps to break down clots. The nice thing is that it doesn't break down clots when they aren't there. It's not like, taking warfarin or something like that where you're actually going to increase your risk of having a, thrombotic or a hemorrhagic episode, right? It doesn't do that. It acts on the clots that are in the body. It acts on things that are already there. So it's not, I would say that if somebody had like whole brain radiation, real specific, or even if they had like a few gamma knife treatments or something, and they just came off of that and their brain was really like, the vessels were very friable, then I would be careful with using like high dose fish oil, high dose ginkgo, lumbrokinase, and aspirin or something like that, where they could have that could make them more likely to bleed. So you always are a little bit conservative in that case, where specifically that with brain radiation. But most of the time, this is very safe to use. Upregulates PAI1, inhibiting plasminogen conversion to effectively, actually should say, inducing plasminogen conversion to plasmin, aiding in, what am I doing here? Oh, cancer upregulates. Yeah, sorry. It reverses this last statement. It downregulates plasminogen activator inhibitor 1. It upregulates plasminogen, converts it to plasmin. So safe, non-toxic, low side effects. There's actually a study that's been ongoing with a taxane drug, like Taxol, combined with lumbrokinase as like a multi-part drug that they're studying because the lumbrokinase does so much to help the effectiveness of the chemo. So it's really cool. It's actually made it to that level. Reduces fibrinogen. Dosage 1 to 3 caps, 30 to 90 milligrams, 2 to 3 times daily. For folks that have really high D-dimer, I'll often do 9 caps a day for a while till I get it down, especially because I don't want someone to have a stroke. I'd really like to protect them from that. Yes.
Do you think lumbrokinase is sufficient to replace something like Eliquis, someone's high risk?
The thing is you just can't really mess with that stuff, when it comes down to that type of a thing. It has to be, if people have AFib, you got to look at their CHADS2 score, see what their risks are. If they're in the risk category, if they're having AFib, that means the blood's going to pool in the atria and they're going to be at risk, right? You can't just go to lumbrokinase and be like, this is going to protect you. If someone's like, hey, I'm not going to do Eliquis, sure, I'll help you, but I'm not going to have anything to do with you not doing it if your cardiologist recommends it. There's a certain amount of time you'll need to be on it, apixaban, whatever it is that you're on, and until you've stabilized your heart, you're not having any AFib. So if you're not having any AFib, you shouldn't be at risk. In that case, so if you're working to calm the heart, you're starting to work to digest the fibrin and things like that. They come off of Eliquis, everything's stable. They do their Zeo patch or their heart Holter monitor, everything looks good. 2 weeks of no AFib. Cool. You can regulate with lumbrokinase, with the herbal formulas and things like that and really just protect them, for sure.
Is there good data behind the thing I've heard that if your AFib never lasts more than 24 hours, then you're not predisposed to having clots and don't need to be anticoagulated?
Question is, if your AFib is only lasting less than 24 hours, is it true that you don't need to be anticoagulated? God, I don't know. That's a question for a cardiologist. I'm not sure. I don't know. That would imply that it would take more than 24 hours of blood pooling in the atria to cause a clot, and I don't.
Thrown on an anticoag, even if they have it
Right.
on a pulse thermometer.
Right. I'm sure that it's, because it's a very litigious society we live in, people are just really wanting to cover themselves. There's a lot of liability. They're just throw you on, on a anticoagulant just to make sure they did the right thing, right? They cover their own risk. Yeah.
A lot of AFib people that are like an AFib or VR in the 180s and they don't have any symptoms. So even if Holter monitor only shows say 6 hours, you can't guarantee they're not going to fill out the periods.
Right. The ZO patch is pretty good as far as you can, if you're looking over the course of 2 weeks and you can just see how many events they had, how long they were in AFib, and then, how many premature ventricular contractions, how many everythings they have, like tachycardia events, all that kind of stuff. You can see it all. I was just saying if they had done that and their cardiologist was like, hey, you're not in AFib. If you want to go off the Eliquis, after 6 months, then you could do that. Then that's when I could say, oh, great, I can support you, But again, like with liability issues, you got to be really careful around this stuff, And granted, the Eliquis does have now an antidote for it. So originally it was a little weird because for the first couple of years while it was in circulation, they didn't have an antidote for it, meaning that you could stop the drug, but you'd still be at risk of a hemorrhagic event even for a little while. Now there's a good antidote, so it's much safer. Nattokinase, this is more specific for the cardiovascular system. It's really good to work, dissolving fibrin, looking like plasmin, right? Enhances production of plasmin and other clot dissolving agents. Prevents hardening of the arteries with an oral dose of as little as 100 milligrams. And I dose it between 50 and 200 milligrams 2 to 3 times a day between meals. And especially if you really want to be protective of people, you want to make sure you're dosing these things frequently, because they're not going to stay in the body for 24 hours. If you want to make sure that they're being protected over a course of time, every 8 hours, you got to dose them again so that they're having that constant breakdown of fibrin. Here's bromelain. Inhibits platelet aggregation, has fibrinolytic activity, anti-inflammatory, anti-tumor. It's really good in cancer, and it's really good for fluid buildup. So when someone has like fluid buildup, like you sprained your ankle, whatever, you have ascites, things like that, you have tumor edema, bromelain is the way to go. It's really good at getting the fluid out. Fatty acids, EPA and DHA, really good also for preventing the coagulation. You can get gamma-linolenic acid, right, from pine seed, borage, blackcurrant, evening primrose. Sea buckthorn, really good at protecting the system from oxidative damage. Palmitoleic acid, and then that N7, that's a really interesting one, good for mucous membranes. So, oral membranes, vaginal membranes, really good to just nourish tissues that way. Oleic acid from olive oil. Olive oil is amazing, right? Oleorupin, oleic acid, so much benefit, protection. And then CLA also has anti-cancer and anti-obesity activities. So combining fatty acids together in a whole complex is a great way to go. So here's Salvia miltiorhiza, the Chinese salvia. I love this plant. It does so many amazing things. Dan Shen, heart tonic, and for angina, palpitations, menstrual problems, insomnia, blood stagnation. It's a great reliever of stagnant blood. And so it's got these salvionolic acids in it and this tanshinone complex that are really, really powerful. You can see that it has anti-arrhythmia effects, very good in arrhythmias and AFib and things, using Salvia miltiorhiza. Vasorelaxant, vasodilating, calcium channel inhibition. A few references for all that. Anti-atherosclerosis, inhibits HIF1, NF-kappa beta, BCL2, tumor necrosis factor alpha. Tanshinone 2A reduces cell adhesion, has anti-tumor effects, collagen synthesis. So many amazing things from this plant, and it's such a great one. In Chinese medicine, it's really used for the heart oftentimes, like really good for angina, really good. You combine it with like a shui fu juyu tong, like a remove stagnation in the heart formula that you add the salvia to it. It gets really powerful. Here's turmeric, curcumin. You take it with bromelain, and you get this really nice breakdown of that cloaking that the tumor uses by hijacking the platelets. C-reactive protein. Really good marker to use, right? It's an acute phase reactant. Also, like ferritin is acute phase reactant. Ceruloplasmin, acute phase reactants. It's part of the insulin-related inflammatory process associated with insulin resistance. 9 systemic reviews. CRP was determined to be the best candidate for use in screening and the most rigorously studied for inflammation. So here's cholesterol in the blood vessels. Generally doesn't cause danger, but when you have inflammation, which promotes oxidative stress and damage, now you have problems. The inflammation weakens the plaque, makes it more vulnerable to bursting or pinching off a clot that can then block a coronary artery. That's what I was describing earlier, right? That's the same story. Marker for heart disease in people with no disease symptoms. So always keep an eye on that one when you can. Homocysteine, a non-protein forming sulfur-containing amino acid, eliminated through one of two pathways. And you'll see this with people that if they have elevated homocysteine, it's often a methionine cycle problem. And most people either have a too low or too high if they have a problem. And you want to address it. If people have high homocysteine, you can use trimethylglycine, you use reduced folic acid, you use methyl donors, basically. And there's some great products out there. I like one from Designs for Health. It's called Homocysteine Supreme. It's just a really great one. You'll look at the ingredients. It works really well to bring homocysteine levels down. And when you find the dose that works to keep somebody in the normal range, which for me is about under 8, but not below 6, so right in that little zone, then they're protected. Because you can see here, for each 5 micromole per liter increase, the risk of CVD increased 20 to 50%. So big correlation between homocysteine and cardiovascular disease. Genetic alterations, like I said, this can often be problems with methylation. Folate, B6, B12, alpha-glycerylphosphorylcholine, TMG, and resveratrol, all helpful. 11 studies, linearly and positively associated with all risk of all-cause mortality. And here you go, chronic stress hormone release. Gosh, stress just seems to be a problem, guys. It just keeps showing up everywhere, you know? Here you have it, calm the Shen, calm the nervous system. Botanical nervines, right? Everything from your chamomile to kava, your more sedating herbs, things like tetrahydropalmitine, from corydalis. You've got the GABA enhancers, things like glycine and GABA itself. Theanine is a really good one to enhance GABA. All these things will help to calm the nervous system and will have a net anti-cancer effect. And they will reduce coagulation also. Adaptogens are really good for the whole stress response. And there's that cycle: stress, inflammation, glucose and insulin, oxidative damage, cancer. So this is a big cycle that we need to get in the middle of and block it on all those little arrows, block all those places. The liver and anger, super important. We have to make sure that the liver energy moves. The person can deal with their emotional traumas. Definitely good to get emotional trauma work done to help with the liver. And you can help with all these formulas and herbs that will move the liver and promote the free flow of energy for them. Association of anger and hostility with future coronary heart disease, right? Back to this Chinese medicine concept, liver stagnation leads to problems, leads to disease. What kind of herbs we use for the Shen, for the heart, blood circulation, all the things I mentioned, hawthorn, salvia, olive leaf, nodo ginseng, arjuna. These are all things you can combine together in a formula. There's a beautiful hawthorn tree. Herbs to nourish, invigorate, and or remove the blood. There's the nodo ginseng, the Chinese salvia, the angelica, which nourishes and moves the blood. Romania, especially the prepared form, which nourishes the marrow and the essence in the kidneys. Yellow dock as an alternative. Peony moves the liver energy and builds the blood. And then saffron, very oxygenating to the blood and to the tissues. Ginkgo, we all think of this as a really good one. It inhibits platelet activating factors. It stops the platelets from aggregating gently. But also really good for beta amyloid, inhibits fibrosis. So really good for the neurodegeneration. Reduces post-radiation edema and brain tumors. Really beautiful stuff for ginkgo. Free radical scavenger, membrane stabilizer, vasodilator, inhibits platelet activating factor. So I just want to circle back here to our correlations before we wrap up, right? So we've got our pathological factors. This should make more sense now, right? So take a look at this. Like, just hang out with this list whenever you want to and just look at it. You're thinking about things and think about how many of these layers cross over. When you have the spleen dampness picture with the invisible phlegm, person probably has insulin and glucose problems. They might have some oxidative damage and microbiota imbalance, probably some lipid imbalances and probably some inflammation too, right? Liver stagnation, we just saw how that leads to hypercoagulation and angiogenesis. All of it's just so tied together, and if you go back through this talk, you'll see how it works. A good scientist has freed himself of concepts and keeps his mind open to what is the Tao Te Ching. So keep your minds open, everybody. Have a great weekend. I'm so glad you're all here. Thanks for showing up today. That was really fun. Yeah. Thanks.